Chapter 14 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caron. True to the Old Flag by G.A. Henty. Chapter 14. Rescued. Harold was deeply touched at the evidences of the fate which had befallen the occupants of his cousin's plantation. If there are any more of these to be found, pointing to their remains, we might learn for a certainty whether the same fate befell them all. The Seneca spoke a word to its followers, and the four Indians spread themselves over the clearing. One more body was found. It was lying down near the water, as if killed in the act of making for the canoe. "The others are probably there," Peter said, pointing to the ruins. "The three hands was killed in the fields, and most likely the attack was made at the same moment on the house." "I'm pretty sure it was so, for the body by the water lies face downward, with his head toward the lake. He was no doubt shot from behind as he was running. There must have been Injuns round the house then, or he would have made for that instead of the water." The Seneca touched Peter on the shoulder and pointed toward the farm. A figure was seen approaching. As it came nearer, they could see that he was a tall man, dressed in the deerskin shirt and leggings usually worn by hunters. As he came near, Harold gave an exclamation. "It is Jack Pearson!" "It are Jack Pearson," the hunter said. "But for the moment I can't recollect ye, though your face seems known." "Why," he exclaimed in changed tones, "is that boy Harold growed into a man?" "It is," Harold replied, grasping for the frontiersman's hand. "And ye may know me too," Peter Lambton said, "though it's 20 years since we fought side by side against the Mohawks." "Why, old hoss, are you above ground still?" the hunter exclaimed heartily. "I'm glad to see you again, old friend. And what are you doing here, you and Harold and these Senecas? For they is Senecas, sure enough." "I've been in the woods for the last hour, and have been puzzling myself nigh to death. I seed them Injuns going about over the clearing sarching, and for the life of me I couldn't think what they were a-doing. Then I seed 'em gathered down here, with 2 white men among 'em, so I guessed it was right to show myself." "They were searching to see how many had fallen in this terrible business," Harold said, pointing to the ruins. The hunter shook his head. "I'm afeard they've all gone under. I were here a week afterward. It were just as it is now. I found 3 hands lying killed and scalped in the fields. The others, I reckon, is there. I has no doubt at all about Bill Welsh and his wife, but it may be that the gal has been carried off." "Do you think so?" Harold exclaimed eagerly. "If so, we may find her too, with the other." "What other?" Pearson asked. Harold gave briefly an account of the reason which had brought them to the spot and of the object they had in view. "You can count me in," Pearson said. "There's just a chance that Nellie Welsh may be in their hands still, and in any case, I'm longing to draw a beard on some of the varmints to pay 'em for this." And he looked round him, and 100 other massacres round his frontier. "I'm glad to hear ye say so," Peter replied. "I expected as much of ye, Jack. I don't know much of this country, having only hunted here for a few weeks with a party of Delawares 20 year afore the Iroquois moved so far west." "I know pretty nigh every foot of it," Jack Pearson said. "When the Iroquois were quiet, I used to do a deal of hunting in their country. It are good country for the game." "Well, shall we set out at once?" Harold asked, impatient to be off. "We can't move tonight," Pearson answered, and Harold saw that Peter and the Indians agreed with him. "Why not?" he asked. "Every hour is of importance." "That's so," Peter said, "but there's no going out on the lake tonight. In half an hour we'll have our first snowstorm, and by morning it will be 2 foot deep." Harold turned his eyes toward the lake and saw what his companions had noticed long before. The sky was overcast, and a thick bank of hidden clouds was rolling up across the lake, and the thick mist seemed to hang between the clouds and the water. "That's snow," Peter said. "It's late this year." and I'd give my pension if it was a month later." "That's so," Pearson said. "Snow ain't never pleasant in the woods, but when you're scouting round among Injuns it are a caution. We'd best make a shelter afore it comes on." The two canoes were lifted from the water, unloaded, and turned bottom upward. A few charred planks, which had formed part of the roof of the outhouses, were brought and put up to form a sort of shelter. A fire was lit and a meal prepared. By this time the snow had begun to fall. After the meal was over, pipes were lit and the two hunters earnestly talked over the plains, the Seneca chief throwing in a few words occasionally. The others listened quietly. The Indians left the matter in the hands of their chief, while Harold and Cameron knew that the two frontiersmen did not need any suggestion from them. As to Jake, the thought of asking questions never entered his mind. He was just at present less happy than usual, for the negro, like most of his race, hated cold, and the prospect of wandering through the woods in deep snow made him shudder as he crouched close to the great fire they had built. Peter and Jack Pearson were of opinion that it was exceedingly probable that the Welches had been destroyed by the very band which had carried off little Janet Cameron. The bodies of Indians who had been on the warpath with the army had retired some 6 weeks before, and it was about that time, Pearson said, that the attack on the settlements had been made. "I heard some parties of redskins who had been with the British troops had passed through the neighborhood, and there was reports that they were greatly unsatisfied with the results of the campaign. As likely as not some of that band may have been consarned in the attack on this place 3 years ago, and passing near it may have determined to wipe out that defeat. An Injun never forgives. Many of their braves fell here, and they could scarcely bring a more welcome trophy back to their villages than the scalps of Welch and his men. Now the first thing to do," Peter said, "is to find out what particular chief took his braves with him to the war. When we've got to find his village, and there likely enough we'll find Cameron's daughter and maybe the girl from here. How old was she?" "About 15, Pearson said, "and a fine girl, and a pretty girl, too. I dun know," he went on after a pause, "which of the chiefs took part in the war across the lakes, but I suspect it were War Eagle. There's 3 great chiefs, and the other 2 were trading on the frontier. It was War Eagle who attacked the place before, and would be the more likely to attack it again if he came anywhere near it. He made a mess of it afore, and be burning to wipe out his failure if he had a chance." "Where is this place?" "His village is the furthest of them all from here. He lives up near the falls of Sault Ste. Marie, betwixt Lake Superior and Huron. It's a village with nigh 300 wigwams. It ain't easy to see how it's to be done. We must make to the north shore of the lake. There'll be no working down here through the woods, but it's a pesky difficult job, about as hard a one as ever I took part in." "It is that," Pearson said. "It can't be denied. To steal 2 white girls out of a big Injun village ain't an easy job at no time. But with the snow on the ground, it comes as nigh to an impossibility as anything can do." For another hour or two they talked over the route they should take and their best mode of proceeding. Duncan Cameron sat and listened with an intent face to every word. Since he had joined them he had spoken but seldom. His whole soul was taken up with the thought of his little daughter. He was ever ready to do his share, and more than his share of the work of paddling and at the portages, but he never joined in the conversation. And of an evening, when the others sat round the fire, he would move away and pace backward and forward in anxious thought until the fire burned low and the party wrapped themselves in their blankets and went off to sleep. All the time the conversation had been going on the snow had fallen heavily, and before it was concluded the clearing was covered deep with the white mantle. There was little wind, and the snow fell quietly and noiselessly. At night the Indians lay down round the fire, while the white men crept under the canoes and were soon fast asleep. In the morning it was still snowing, but about noon it cleared up. It was freezing hard, and the snow glistened as the sun burst through the clouds. The stillness of the forest was broken now by sharp cracking sounds as boughs of trees gave way under the weight of snow. In the open it lay more than 2 feet deep. "Now," Peter said, "the sooner we're off the better." "I'll come in my own canoe," Pearson said. "One of the Injuns can come with me, and we'll keep up with the rest." "There's room for you in the other canoes," Harold said. "Plenty of room," the hunter answered. "But you see, Harold, the more canoes the better. There ain't no saying how close we may be chased, and by hiding up the canoes at different places we give ourselves so much more chance of being able to get to one or the other. They're all large canoes, and at a pinch any one of them might hold the whole party, with the 2 gals throwed in. But," he added to Harold in a low voice, "don't you build too much on these gals, Harold. I wouldn't say so while that poor fellow's listening, but the chance is a desperate poor one, and I think we'll be mighty lucky ef we don't leave all our scalps in that 'ere redskin village." The traps were soon placed in the canoes, and just as the sun burst out the 3 boats started. It was a long and toilsome journey. Stormy weather set in, and they were obliged to wait for days by the lake till its surface calmed. On these occasions they devoted themselves to hunting and killed several deer. They knew that there were no Indian villages near, and in such weather it would be improbable that any redskins would be in the woods. They were enabled, therefore, to fire without fear of the reports betraying their presence. The Senecas took the opportunity of fabricating snowshoes for the whole party, as these would be absolutely necessary for walking in the woods. Harold, Jake, and Duncan Cameron at once began to practice their use. The negro was comical in the extreme in his first attempts, and shouted so loudly with laughter each time that he fell head foremost into the snow that Peter said to him angrily, "Look a here, Jake, it's dangerous enough letting off a rifle at a deer in these woods, but it has to be done because we must lay in a supply of food. But a musket shot is a mere whisper to your shouting. Thunder ain't much louder than you laughing. It shakes the hull place and might be heard from here well nigh to Montreal. If you can't keep that mouth of yourn shut, you must stop up of the idea of learning to use them shoes, and must stop in the canoe while we're scouting on shore." Jake promised to amend, and from this time, when he fell in the soft snow wreaths, he gave no audible vent to his amusement, but a pair of great feet, with the snowshoes attached, could be seen waving above the surface until he was picked up and righted again. Harold soon learned, and Cameron went at the work with grim earnestness. No smile ever crossed his face at his own accidents, or at the wild vagaries of Jake, which excited silent amusement even among the Indians. In a short time the falls were less frequent, and by the time they reached the spot where they were determined to cross the lake at the point where Lakes Huron and Michigan join, the 3 novices were able to make fair progress in the snowshoes. The spot fixed upon was about 12 miles from the village of War Eagle, and the canoes were hidden at distances of 3 miles apart. First Pearson, Harold, and Cameron disembarked. Jake, Peter, and one of the Indians alighted at the next point, and the Seneca chief and 2 of his followers proceeded to the spot nearer to the Indian village. Each party as they landed struck straight into the woods, to unite at a point 8 miles from the lake and as many from the village. The hunters had agreed that, should any Indians come across the tracks, less suspicion would be excited than would have been the case where they found skirting the river, as it might be thought that they were made by Indians out hunting. Harold wondered how the other parties would find the spot to which Pearson had directed them, but in due time all arrived at the rendezvous. After some search, a spot was found where the underwood grew thickly, and there was an open place in the center of the clump. In this the camp was established. It was composed solely of a low tent of about 2 feet high, made of deer hides, sewed together, and large enough to shelter them all. The snow was cleared away. Sticks were driven into the frozen ground, and strong poles laid across them. The deerskin was then laid flat upon these. The top was a little higher than the general level of the snow. An inch or 2 of snow was scattered over it, and to anyone passing outside the bushes the tent was completely invisible. The Indians now went outside the thicket, and with great care obliterated, as far as possible, the marks upon the snow. This could not be wholly done, but it was so far complete that the slightest wind which would send a drift over the surface would wholly conceal all traces of passage. They had, before crossing the lake, cooked a supply of food sufficient for some days. Intense as was the cold outside, it was perfectly warm in the tent. The entrance as they crept into it was closed with a blanket, and in the center a lamp composed of deer's fat in a calabash with a cotton wick gave a sufficient light. "What is the next move?" Harold asked. "The chief'll start when it comes dusk, with Pearson," Peter said. "When they get close to the village he'll go in alone. He'll paint Iroquois before he goes." "Cannot we be near at hand to help them in case of a necessity?" Harold asked. "No," Peter said. "It wouldn't be no good at all. Ef it comes to fighting they're 50 to 1, and the lot of us would have no more chance than two. If they're found out, which ain't likely, they must run for it, and they can get over the snow a deal faster than you could, to say nothing of Cameron and Jake. They must shift for themselves, and'll make straight for the nearest canoe. In the forest they must be run down sooner or later, for their tracks would be plain. No, they must go alone." When night came on, the Seneca produced his paints, and one of his followers marked his face and arms with the lines and flourishes in use by the Iroquois. When without a word of adieu he took his rifle and glided out from the tent, followed by Pearson. Peter also put on his snowshoes and prepared to follow. "I thought you were going to stay here, Peter." "No, I'm going halfway with him. I'll be able to hear the sound of a gun. Then ef they're trapped, we must make tracks for the canoes at once, for after following 'em to the lake they're safe to take up their back track to see where they've come from. So if I hear a gun, I'll make back here as quick as I can come." When the three men had started, silence fell on the tent. The redskins at once lay down to sleep, and Jake followed their example. Harold lay quiet thinking over the events which had happened to him in the last 3 years, while Cameron lay with his face turned toward the lamp with a set, anxious look on his face. Several times he crawled into the entrance and listened when the crack made by some breaking bough came to his ear. Hours passed, and at last Harold dozed off, but Cameron's eyes never closed until about midnight. The blanket at the entrance moved and Peter entered. "Ha' you seen the ithers?" Cameron exclaimed. "No, and we're not likely to," Peter answered. "It was all still to the time I came away, and afore I moved I was sure they must have left the village. They won't come straight back. Bless ye, they'll go away in the opposite direction and make a sweep miles round. They may not be here for hours yet. Not that there's much chance of their tracks being traced. It has not showed for over a week, and the snow round the village must be trampled thick for a mile and more, with the squaws coming and going for wood and the hunters going out on the chase. I've crossed a dozen tracks or more on my way back. If it wasn't for that, we daren't have gone at all, for ef the snow was new fallen the sight of fresh tracks would have set the first Injun that come along a-wondering. And when a redskin begins to wonder, he sets to ease his mind at once by finding out all about it, if it takes him a couple of days, sarch to do so. No, you could lie down now for some hours. They won't be here till morning." So saying, the scout set the example by wrapping himself up and going to sleep, but Cameron's eyes never closed until the blanket was drawn on one side again, and in the gray light of the winter morning the Seneca and Pearson crawled into the tent. "What news?" Harold asked, for Cameron was too agitated to speak. "Both gals are there," Pearson answered. An exclamation of thankfulness broke from Harold. A sob of joy issued from the heart of the Scotchman, and for a few minutes his lips moved as he poured forth his silent thankfulness to God. "Wall, tell us about it," Peter said. "I can ask the chief any questions afterward." "We went on straight enough to the village," the hunter began. "It are larger than when I saw it last, and War Eagle's influence in the tribe must have increased. I didn't expect to find no watch, the redskins having so far as they knew no enemies within 500 mile of 'em. There was a lot of fires burning and plenty of redskins moving about among 'em. We kept on till we got quite close, and then we lay up for a time below a tree at the edge of the clearing. There were a sight too many of 'em about for the Seneca to go in yet a while. About half an hour arter, we got there, we saw two white gals come outen one of the wigwams and stand for a while to warm themselves by one of the fires. The tallest of the two, well nigh a woman, was Nellie Welsh. I knew her, in course. The other was 3 or 4 years younger, with yeller hair all over her shoulders. Nellie seemed quiet and sad-like, but the other 'peared more at home. She laughed with some of the redskin gals, and even jeaned in the play. You see, he said, turning to Cameron, she'd been captured longer, and children's spirits soon rise again. Arter a while they went back to the wigwam. When the fires burned down and the crowd thinned, and there was only a few left sitting in groups round the embers, the Seneca started. For a long time I saw nothing of him, but once or twice I thought I saw a figure moving among the wigwams. Presently the fires burned quite down, and the last Injun went off. I had begun to wonder what the chief was doing, when he stood beside me. We made tracks at once, and have been tramping in a long circle all night. The chief can tell ye his part of the business itself. Well, chief, what have you found out? Peter asked. The Indian answered in his native tongue, which Peter interpreted from time to time for the benefit of his white companions. When Deertail left the white hunter, he went into the village. It was no use going among the men, and he went round by the wigwams and listened to the chattering of the squawks. The tribe were all well contented, for the band brought back a great deal of plunder which they had picked up on their way back from the army. They had lost no braves, and everyone was pleased. The destruction of the settlement of the white man who had repulsed them before was a special matter for rejoicing. The scalps of the white man and his wife are in the village. War Eagle's son, young Elk, is going to marry the white girl. There are several of the braves whose heads have been turned by the white skin and her bright eyes, but young Elk is going to have her. There have been great feastings and rejoicings since the return of the warriors, but they are to be joined tomorrow by Beaver's band, and then they will feast again. When all was quiet, I went to the wigwam where the white girls are confined. An old squaw and 2 of War Eagle's daughters are with them. Deertail had listened while they prepared for rest, and knew on which side of the wigwam the tall white maiden slept. He thought that he would be awake. Her heart would be sad, and sleep would not come to her son. So he crept around there and cut a slit in the skin close to where she lay. He put his head in at the hole and whispered, "Do not let the white girl be afraid. It is a friend." "Does she hear him?" She whispered. "Yes, friends are near," he said. "The young warrior Harold, whom she knows, and others are at hand to take her away. The Iroquois will be feasting tomorrow night. When she hears the cry of the night owl, let her steal away with her little white sister, and she will find her friends waiting." Then Deertail closed the slit and stole away to his friend the white hunter. "I have spoken." "Just what I expected of you, chief," Peter said warmly. "I thought as how you'd manage to get speech with them somehow. If there's a feast tonight, it's hard if we don't manage to get 'em off." "I suppose we must lie still all day, Peter." "You must go," the hunter said. "Not a soul must show his nose outside the tent, except that one of the redskins will keep watch to be sure that no straggler has come across our tracks and followed 'em up. If he was to do that, he might bring the hull gang down on us. Ye'd best get as much sleep as ye can, for ye know when ye may get another chance." At nightfall the whole party issued from the tent and started toward the Indian village. All arrangements had been made. It was agreed that Pearson and the Seneca would go up to the village, the former being chosen because he was known to Nellie. Peter and one of the redskins were to take post 100 yards further back, ready to give assistance in case of alarm, while the rest were to remain about half a mile distant. Cameron had asked that he might go with the advance party, but upon Peter pointing out to him that his comparatively slow rate of progression in snowshoes would, in case of discovery, lead to the recapture of the girls, he at once agreed to the decision. If the flight of the girls was discovered soon after leaving the camp, it was arranged that the Seneca and Peter should hurry at once with them to the main body, while the other 2 Indians should draw off their pursuers in another direction. In the event of anything occurring to excite the suspicion of the Indians before there was a chance of the girls being brought safely to the main body, they were to be left to walk quietly back to camp, as they had nothing to fear from the Indians. Peter and the Seneca were then to work round by a circuitous route on the boat, were to be joined by the main body, and to draw off until another opportunity offered for repeating the attempt. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when Pearson and the Seneca approached the village. The fires were burning high, and seated round them were all the warriors of the tribe. A party were engaged in a dance representing the pursuit and defeat of an enemy. The women were standing in an outer circle, clapping their hands and raising their voices in loud cries of applause and excitement as the dance became faster and faster. The warriors bounded high, brandishing their tomahawks. A better time could not have been chosen for the evasion of the fugitives. Nellie Welsh stood close to a number of Indian girls, but slightly behind them. She held the hand of little Janet Cameron. Although she appeared to share in the interest of the Indians in the dance, a close observer would have had no difficulty in perceiving that Nellie was preoccupied. She was, indeed, intently listening for the signal. She was afraid to move from among the others, lest her absence should be at once detected. But so long as the noise was going on she despaired of being able to hear the signal agreed upon. Presently an Indian brave passed close to her, and as she did so, he passed on and moved round the circle, as if intending to take a seat at another point. The excitement of the dance was momentarily increasing, and the attention of the spectators was riveted to the movements of the performers. Holding Janet's hand, Nellie moved noiselessly away from the place where she had been standing. The movement was unnoticed, and she was no longer closely watched, a flight in the depth of winter appearing impossible. She kept round the circle till no longer visible from the spot she had left. Then, leaving the crowd, she made her way toward the nearest wigwams. Once behind these, the girls stole rapidly along under their shelter until they stood behind that which they usually inhabited. 2 figures were standing there. They hesitated for a moment, but one of them advanced. "Jack Pearson!" Nellie exclaimed, with a low cry of gladness. "Just that same, Nellie, and right glad to see you. But we've no time for greeting now. The Hull tribe may be after us in another 5 minutes. Come along, pretty," he said, turning to Janet. "You'll find somebody you know close at hand." 2 minutes later, the child in her father's arms, and after a moment's rapturous greeting between father and child, a very delighted one between Nellie Welsh and her cousin Harold, the flight was continued. "How long a start do you think we may have?" "Half an hour, maybe some time afore they miss her, and they'll search for her everywhere afore they give the alarm, as they'll be greatly blamed for their carelessness." There had been a pause in the flight for a few seconds, when the Seneca and Pearson arrived with the girls at the point where Peter and the other Indian were posted, 200 yards from the camp. Up to this point the snow was everywhere thickly trampled, but as the camp was left further behind the footprints would naturally become more scarce. Here Pearson fastened to the girls' feet 2 pairs of large moccasins. Inside these wooden soles had been placed. They therefore acted to some extent like snowshoes, and prevented the girls' feet from sinking deeply, while the prints on which they left bore no resemblance to their own. They were strapped on the wrong way, so that the marks would seem to point toward the village rather than away from it. Both girls protested that they should not be able to get along fast in these, but one of the men posted himself on either side of each and assisted them along, and as the moccasins were very light, even with the wooden soles inside, they were soon able to move with them at a considerable pace. Once united, the whole party kept along at the top of their speed. Peter Lambton assisted Cameron with Janet, and the girl, half lifted from the ground, skimmed over the surface like a bird, only touching the snow here and there with the moccasins. Nellie Welsh needed no assistance from Harold or Pearson. During the long winters she had often practiced on snowshoes, and was consequently but little encumbered with the huge moccasins, which to some extent served the same purpose. They had been nearly half an hour on their way when they heard a tremendous yell burst from the village. "They've missed you," Peter said. "Now it's a fair race. We've got a good start, and 'll get more, for they'll have to hunt up the traces very carefully, and it may be an hour, perhaps more, before they strike upon the right one. If the snow had been new fallen we should have had them arter us in 5 minutes." but even a redskin's eyes will be puzzled to find out at night one track among such hundreds." "I have but one fear," Pearson said to Harold. "What is that?" "I'm afeared that without waiting to find the tracks they may send off half a dozen parties to the lake. They'll be sure that friends have taken the gals away, and will know that their only chance of escape is by the water. On land we should be hunted down to certainty, and the redskins, knowing that the gals should not travel fast, will not hurry in following up the trail. So I think they'll at once send off parties to watch the lake, and'll like enough make no effort to take up the trail till tomorrow morning." This was said in a low whisper, for although they were more than 2 miles from the village, it was necessary to move as silently as possible. "You had best tell the others what you think, Pearson. It may make a difference in our movements." A short halt was called, and the Seneca and Peter quite agreed with Pearson's idea. "We best make for the canoe that's furthest off. When the redskins find the others, which they're pretty sure to do, for they'll hunt every bush, they're likely to be satisfied, and to make sure they'll catch us at one or the other." This much decided upon, they continued their flight, now less rapidly, but in perfect silence. Speed was less an object than concealment. The Indians might spread, and a party might come across them by accident. If they could avoid this, they were sure to reach their canoe before morning and unlikely to find the Indians there before them. It was about 12 miles to the spot where they had hidden the canoe, and although they heard distant shouts and whoops ringing through the forest, no sound was heard near them. End of chapter 14. Recording by Caron. Chapter 15 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A recording by Caron. True to the Old Flag by G. A. Henty. Chapter 15. The Island Refuge. The night was intensely cold and still as the stars shone brightly through the bare boughs overhead. "Are you sure you are going all right?" Nellie asked Harold. "It is so dark here that it seems impossible to know which way we are going." "You can trust the Indians," Harold said. "Even if there was not a star to be seen they could find their way by some mysterious instinct. How you are grown, Nellie. Your voice does not seem much changed, and I am longing to see your face." "I expect you are more changed than I am, Harold," the girl answered. "You have been going through so much since we last met, and you seem to have grown so tall and big. Your voice has changed very much, too. It is the voice of a man. How in the world did you find us here?" Pearson had gone on ahead to speak to the Seneca, but he now joined them again. "You mustn't talk," he said. "I hope there's no redskins within 5 miles of us now, but there's never any saying there may be." There was, Harold thought, a certain sharpness in the hunter's voice, which told of a greater anxiety than would be caused by the very slight risk of the quietly spoken words being heard by passing redskins, and he wondered what it could be. They were now, he calculated, within a mile of the hiding place where they had left the boat, and they had every reason for believing that none of the Indians would be likely to have followed by the shore so far, that they would be pursued, and that, in so heavily laden a canoe, they would have great difficulty in escaping. He was well aware, but he relied on the craft of the hunters and Senecas for throwing their pursuers off the trail. All at once the trees seemed to open in front, and in a few minutes the party reached the river. A cry of astonishment and of something akin to terror broke from Harold. As far as the eye could reach the lake was frozen. Their escape was cut off. "That's just what I've been expecting," Pearson said. "The ice had begun to form at the edge when we landed, and 3 days and nights of such frost as we've had since was enough to freeze Ontario. What on earth's to be done?" No one answered. Peter and the redskins had shared Pearson's anxiety, but to Harold and Cameron the disappointment was a terrible one. As to Jake, he left all the thinking to be done by the others. Harold stood gazing helplessly on the expanse of ice which covered the water. It was not a smooth sheet, but was rough and broken, as if, while it had been forming, the wind had broken the ice up into cakes again and again, while the frost was often had bound them together. They had struck the river within a few hundred yards of the place where the canoe was hidden, and, after a short consultation between the Seneca chief, Peter Lambton, and Pearson moved down toward the spot. "What are you thinking of doing?" Harold asked when they gathered round the canoe. "We're going to load ourselves with the ammunition and deer's flesh," Peter said, "and make for a rocky island which lies about a mile off here. I noticed it as we landed. There's nothing to do but to fight it out to the last there. It are a good place for defense, for the redskins won't like to come out across the open, and even covered by a dark night they'd show on this white surface. Perhaps they won't trace us." "Not trace us," the trapper repeated scornfully. "Why, when daylight comes they'll pick up our track and follow it as easy as you could that of a wagon across the snow." They were just starting when Harold gave a little exclamation. "What is it, lad?" A flake of snow fell on my face. All looked up. The stars had disappeared. Another flake and another fell on the upturned faces of the party. "Let's thank the great God," Peter said quietly. "There's a chance for our lives yet. Half an hour's snow and the trail'll be lost." Faster and faster the snowflakes came down. Again the leaders consulted. "We must change our plans now," Peter said, turning to the others. "So long as they could easily follow our tracks, it mattered nothing that they'd find the canoe here. But now it's altogether different. We must take it along with us." The weight of the canoe was very small. The greater part of its contents had already been removed. There was a careful look round to see that nothing remained on the bank. Then 4 of the men lifted it on their shoulders, and the whole party stepped out upon the ice. The snow was now falling heavily, and to Harold's eyes there was nothing to guide them in the direction they were following. Even the Indians would have been at a loss had not the Seneca, the instant the snow began to fall, sent on one of his followers at full speed toward the island. Harold wondered at the time what his object could be as the Indian darted off across the ice, but now he understood. Every minute or two the low hoot of an owl was heard, and toward this sound the party directed their way through the darkness and snow. So heavy was the fall that the island rose white before them as they reached it. It was of no great extent, some 20 or 30 yards across, and perhaps twice that length. It rose steeply from the water to a height of from 10 to 15 feet. The ground was rough and broken, and several trees and much brushwood grew in the crevices of the rock. The Seneca and the hunters made a rapid examination of the island, and soon fixed upon the spot for their camp. Toward one end the island was split in two, and an indentation ran some distance up into it. Here a clear spot was found some 3 or 4 feet above the level of the water. It was completely hidden by thick bushes from the sight of anyone approaching by water. There the canoe was turned over, and the girls, who were both suffering from the intense cold, were wrapped up in blankets and placed under its shelter. The camp was at the lower end of the island, and would, therefore, be entirely hidden from the view of Indians gathered upon the shore. In such a snowstorm light would be invisible at a very short distance, and Peter did not hesitate to light a fire in front of the canoe. For 3 hours the snow continued to fall. The fire had been sheltered by blankets, stretched at some distance above it. Long before the snow seized it had sunk down to a pile of red embers. A small tent had now been formed of blankets for the use of the girls. Brushwood had been heaped over this, and upon the brushwood snow had been thrown, the whole making a shelter which would be warm and comfortable in the bitterest weather. A pile of hot embers was placed in this little tent until it was thoroughly heated. Blankets were then spread, and the girls were asked to leave the shelter of the canoe and take their place there. The canoe itself was now raised on 4 sticks 3 feet from the ground. Bushes were laid around it, and snow piled on, thus forming the walls of which the canoe was the roof. All this was finished long before the snow had ceased falling, and this had a smooth white surface all over, so that, to a casual eye, both tent and hut looked like 2 natural ridges of the ground. They were a cheerful party which assembled in this little hut. The remainder of the embers of the fire had been brought in, and intense as was the cold outside, it was warm and comfortable within. Tea was made and pipes filled, and they chatted some time before going to sleep. Duncan Cameron was like a man transfigured. His joy and thankfulness for the recovery of his daughter were unbounded. Harold's pleasure, too, at the rescue of his cousin was very great, and the others were all gratified at the success of their expedition. It was true that the Indians had yet gained no scalps, but Harold had promised them before starting that, should the expedition be successful, they should be handsomely rewarded. "We mustn't reckon as we are safe yet," Peter said in answer to one of Harold's remarks. "The redskins ain't going to let us slip through their fingers so easy as all that. They've lost our trail and have nothing but their senses to guide 'em. But an Injun's senses ain't easily deceived in these woods. Ef the snow begins again and keeps on for 2 or 3 days they may be puzzled, but ef it stops they'll cast a circle round their camp at a distance beyond where we could have got before the snow ceased, and if they find no new trails they'll know that we must be within that circle. Then, as to the boats, when they find as we don't come down to the 2 as they discovered, and that we've not made off by land, they'll guess as there was another canoe hidden somewhere, and they'll search high and low for it, while they don't find it, and then they'll suppose that we may have taken to the ice, and they'll search that. Either they'll get to open water or to the other side. Ef there's open water anywhere within a few miles they may conclude that we've carried a canoe, launched it there, and made off. In that case, when they've searched everywhere, they may give it up. Ef there ain't no such open water, they'll search till they find us. It ain't likely that this island will escape 'em. With 9 good rifles, here we can hold the place against the hull tribe, and as they'd show up against the snow, they can no more attack by night than by day. I don't think our food will hold out beyond 7 or 8 days, Harold said. Just about that, Peter answered, but we can cut a hole in the ice and fish, and can hold out that way, if need be, for weeks. The rest of it is that the ice ain't likely to break up now until the spring. I reckon our only chance is to wait till we get another big snowstorm, and then to make off. The snow will cover our trail as fast as we make it, and once across to the other shore we may get away from the varmints. But I don't disguise from you, Harold, that we're in a very awkward trouble, and that'll need all the craft of the chief here, and all the experience of Pearson and me to get us out of it. The good God has been very merciful to us so far, Duncan Cameron said. He will surely protect us to the end. Had he had sent the snow just when he did, the savages could hae follow our trail at once. It was a miracle wrought in our favor. He has aided us to rescue the twa barns frae the hands of the Indians, and we may surely trust in his protection to the end. My daughter and her friend Hay, I am very sure, before lying down to sleep, entreated his protection. Let us do the same." And the old soldier, taking off his cap, prayed aloud to God to heed and protect them. Harold and the frontiersmen also removed their caps and joined in the prayer, and Senecas looked on, silent and reverent, at an act of worship which was rare among their white companions. As Peter was of opinion that there was no chance whatsoever of any search on the part of the Indians that night, and therefore there was no need to set a watch, the whole party wrapped themselves up in their blankets and were soon asleep. When Harold woke next morning it was broad daylight. The Senecas had already been out and had brought news that a strong party of Indians could be seen moving along the edge of the forest, evidently searching for a canoe. One of the Indians was placed on watch, and 2 or 3 hours later he reported that the Indians were now entirely out of sight and were, when last seen, scouting along the edge of the forest. "Now," Peter said, "the sooner we get another snowstorm the better. If we'd been alone we could have pushed on last night, but the gals was exhausted and would have soon died of the cold. Now, with a fresh start they'd go. Ef we can't cross the lake, I calculate that we're about 30 mile from a p'int on the north shore below the falls of Ste Marie, and we could land there and strike across through the woods for the settlement. It'd be a terrible long journey round the north of Huron, but we must try it ef we can't get across." "But we could go off by night, surely," Harold said, "even if there's no fresh snow." "We could do that," Peter replied, "no doubt of it, but if they were to find our track the next day, or within 3 days, they'd follow us and overtake us afore we got to the settlements. If we was alone, it would be one thing, but with the gals it'd be another altogether. No, we must stop here till a snowstorm comes even if we have to stop for a month." There's no saying how soon some of them Injuns may be loafing around, and we daren't leave a trail for them to take up." They had scarcely ceased speaking when a low call from the Indian placed on watch summoned the chief to his side. A minute later the latter rejoined the group below and said a few words to Peter. "Just as I thought," the latter grumbled, racing with his rifle across his arm. "Here are some of the varmints coming out this 'ere way. Likely enough it's a party of young braves just scouting about on their own account to try and get honor by discovering us when their elders have failed. It would have been better for them to have stopped at home." The party now crept up to the top of the rock, keeping carefully below its crest. "If you show as much as a hair above the top line," Peter said, "they'll see you sartin." "Would it not be well," Harold asked, "for one of us to show himself? There is no possibility of further concealment, and they would go off without any of them being killed. The others might be less bitter against us than they would if they had lost some of their tribe." Peter laughed scornfully. "You haven't had much to do with Injuns, lad, but I should have thought you'd have had a better sense nor that. Haven't these Injuns been a murdering and a slaying along the frontier all summer, falling on defenseless women and children? Marcy and pity ain't in their nature, and fight or no fight, our scalps will dry in their wigwams if they get us into their power. They know that we can shoot and mean to, and that'll make 'em careful of attacking us. And every hour is important. Now," he said to the others, "each of you cover a man and fire straight through your sights when I gives the word. There's others watching them, you may be sure, and if the whole 5 go down together it'll make 'em think twice afore they attack us again." Peering between some loose rocks, so that he could see without exposing his head above the line, Harold watched the 5 Indians approaching. They had evidently some doubts as to the wisdom of the course they were pursuing, and were well aware that they ran a terrible risk standing there in the open before the rifles of those concealed, should the fugitives be really there. Nevertheless, the hope of gaining distinction and the fear of ridicule from those watching them on shore, should they turn back with their mission unaccomplished, inspired them with resolution. When within 300 yards of the island they halted for a long time. They stood gazing fixedly, but although no signs of life could be perceived, they were too well versed in Indian warfare to gain any confidence from the apparent stillness. Throwing themselves flat on the snow and following each other in single line, by which means their bodies were nearly concealed from sight in the track which their leader made through the light, yielding snow, they made a complete circuit of the island. They paused for some time opposite the little forked entrance in which the camp was situated, but apparently saw nothing, for they kept round until they completed the circuit. When they reached the point from which they had started there was, apparently, a short consultation among them. Then they continued their course in the track that they had before made until they reached a spot facing the camp. Then they changed order, and, still prone in the snow, advanced abreast toward the island. "The varmints have guessed that, if we are here, this is the place where we'd be hid," Peter whispered in Harold's ear. As the Indians made their circuit, the party in the island had changed their position, so as always to keep out of sight. They were now on the top of the island, which was a sort of rough plateau. The girls had been warned, when they left them, to remain perfectly quiet in their shelter, whatever noise they might hear. Peter and the Seneca watched the Indians through the holes which they had made with their ramrods through a bank of snow. The others remained flat in the slight depression behind it. At the distance of 150 yards the Indians stopped. "The varmints see something," Peter said. "Maybe they can make out the 2 snow heaps through the bushes. Maybe they can see some of our footsteps in the snow. They're going to fire," he exclaimed. "Up, lads! They may send a bullet into the hut where the gals is hid." In an instant the line of men sprang to their feet. The Indians, taken by surprise at the sudden appearance of a larger number of enemies than they expected, fired a hasty volley, and then sprang to their feet and dashed toward the shore. But they were deadly rifles which covered them. Peter, Harold, and Pearson could be trusted not to miss even a rapidly moving object at that distance, and the men were all good shots, not in regular order, but as each covered his man, the rifles were discharged. 4 out of 5 Indians fell, and an arm of the 5th dropped useless by his side. However, he still kept on. The whites reloaded rapidly, and Harold was about to fire again when Pearson put his hand on his shoulder. "Don't fire. We've shown them that we can shoot straight. It's just as well at present that they shouldn't know how far our rifles will carry." The four Senecas dashed out across the snow and speedily returned, each with a scalp hanging at its belt. A loud yell of anger and lamentation had risen from the woods skirting the shore as the Indians fell, but after this died away deep silence reigned. "What will be their next move?" Cameron asked Peter as they gathered again in their low hut, having placed one of the Indians on watch. "We'll hear nothing of 'em till nightfall," Peter said. "Their first move, now that they know as we're here, will be to send off to fetch up all the tribe who were in search of us. When it comes on dark they will send scouts outside of us on the ice to see as we don't escape. Not that they'd much mind if we did, for they could track us through the snow and come up with us whenever they chose. No, they may not be sure we'll stay where we are. It may be they'll attack us tonight, maybe not. It'd be a thing more risksome than redskins often to undertake to cross the snow under the fire of 9 rifles. I ain't no doubt they'd try to starve us out, for they must know well enough that we can have no great store of provisions. But they know as well as we do that, if another snowstorm comes on, we might slip away from 'em without leaving a footmark behind. It's just that thought as many make 'em attack." "Well, we can beat them off if they do," Harold said confidently. "Well, we may and we may not," the scout answered. "Anyhow, we can kill the rest of them afore they turn us out on this 'ere island." "That's sartin enough," Pearson put in. "But they're a strong tribe, and if they can harden their hearts and make a rush it's all up with us. I allow that it's contrary to their custom, but when they see no other way to do with, they may try." "I suppose if they do try a rush," Harold said, "they will do it against this end of the island?" "Yes, you may bet your money on that," the scout answered. "In other places the rock goes pretty nigh straight up from the water, but here it's an easy landing, being so close to them. They're sure to know all about it. But even if they didn't, the chap that got away would tell 'em. I don't much expect an attack tonight, but the bands won't be back yet. They'll have a grand palaver tonight, and there'll be a big talk afore they decide what is best to be done. So I think we're safe for tonight. Tomorrow we'll set to work and build a shelter for the pretty ones up above, where they'll be safe from stray shots. Then we'll throw up a breastwork, with loose rocks on top of the slope round this cove, so as to give it to 'em hot when they land." "You have plenty of powder?" Harold asked. "Dollops," Peter replied. "More'n we could fire away if we was besieged here for a month." "Then you could spare me 20 pounds or so?" "We could spare you a whole keg if you like. We've got 3 full. But what are you thinking of now, young run?" "I was thinking," Harold answered, "of forming a line of holes, say 3 feet apart, in the ice across the mouth of the cove. If we were to charge them with powder and lay a train between them, we could, when the first dozen or so have passed the line, fire the train and break up the ice. This would prevent the others following and give them such a bad scare that they would probably make off, and we could easily deal with those who had passed the line before we fired it." "That's a good idea of yours, lad. A fust-rate idea. The ice must be a foot thick by this time, and if you put in your charges 8 inches and tamp 'em well down if you'll shiver the ice for a long way round. The idea is a fust-rate one." Pearson and Cameron assisted in the work, and the Indians, when Peter had explained the plan to them, gave deep guttural exclamations of surprise and approval. The process of blasting was one wholly unknown to them. "I will make the holes," Cameron said. "I ha' seen a deal o' blasting when I was in the army. I can heat the end of a ramrod in a fire and hammer it into the shape of a borer." "A better way than that, Cameron," Harold said, "will be to heat the end of a ramrod white hot. You will melt holes in the ice in half the time it would take you to bore them." "That was what I was thinking of doing." "Right you are, lad," Pearson said. "Let's set about it at once." A large fire was now lighted outside the hut for secrecy. The ends of 3 or 4 of the ramrods were placed in the fire, and 2 lines of holes were bored in the ice across the mouth of the little cove. These lines were 12 feet apart, and they calculated that the ice between them would be completely broken up, even if the fractures did not extend a good way beyond the lines. The holes were of rather larger diameter than the interior of a gun barrel. It was found that the ice was about 15 inches thick, and the holes were taken down 10 inches. 3 or 4 charges of powder were placed in each. A stick of quarter of an inch in diameter was then placed in each hole, and pounded ice was rammed tightly in around it until the holes were filled up, a few drops of water being poured in on the top, so as to freeze the whole into a solid mass. There was no fear of the powder being wetted, for the frost was intense. Then the sticks were withdrawn, and the holes left filled with powder. With the heated ramrods, little troughs were sunk half an inch deep, connecting the tops of the holes. Lines of powder were placed in these trenches. Narrow strips of skin were laid over them, and the snow was then thrown on again. The 2 lines of trenches were connected at the ends of the shore, so that they could be fired simultaneously. While the men were occupied with this work, the girls had cooked some venison steaks and made some cakes. It was just nightfall when they had finished, and all sat down and enjoyed a hearty meal. Peter had one of the Senecas undertook the watch for half the night, when they were to be relieved by Pearson the chief. The early part of the night passed off quietly, but an hour before morning the party were aroused by the sharp crack of 2 rifles. Seizing their arms, all rushed out. "What is it, Pearson?" "2 of their scouts," Pearson answered, pointing out to 2 dark bodies on the snow at a distance of about 100 yards. "I suppose they wanted to see if we was on the watch. He made 'em out almost as soon as they left the shore, but we let 'em come on until we was sartin of our aim. There ain't no more about as we can see, so you can all turn in again for another hour or 2. There was no fresh alarm before morning, and when the sun rose it shone over a wide expanse of snow, unbroken, save where lay bodies of the 2 Indians, whose scalps already hung at the belt of the Seneca, and those of their 4 comrades who had fallen in their first attack. The day passed quietly. Toward the afternoon 2 Indians were seen approaching from the shore. They were unarmed and held their hands aloft as the sign of amity. Peter and Pearson at once laid down their guns, left the island, and advanced to meet them. They were Indian chiefs of importance. "Why have my white brothers stolen in at night upon the village of War Eagle and slain his young men?" "It is what you have been doing all last year, chief," Pearson, who spoke the dialect better than Peter, replied. "But we injured no one. We didn't kill women and children, as your warriors have done in the white villages. We only came to take what you had stolen from us, and if your young men had been killed it's only because they tried to attack us. The white men must see," the chief said, "that they cannot get away. The water is hard, and their canoe will not swim in it. The snow is deep, and the tender feet cannot walk through it. My warriors are very numerous, and the white men cannot fight their way through them. The white settlements are very far away, and their friends cannot reach them, and it will be many months before the water softens, and long before that the white men will have eaten their moccasins." "Well, chief," Pearson said, "we're in a tight hole, I grant you, but I'm far from allowing that we ain't no chances left to us yet. But what do you propose? I suppose you've some proposition to make?" "Let the white men leave behind them their guns and their powder and the maidens they have taken from War Eagle's camp, and then let them go in peace. They shall not be harmed." Pearson gave a short laugh. "War Eagle must think the white men are foolish. What's to prevent the red warriors from taking all our scalps when our arms are in their hands?" "The word of a great chief," War Eagle said. "War Eagle never lies." "You may not lie, chief," Pearson said bluntly, "but I've known many a treaty broken afore now. You and your people may not touch us, but there's other redskins about, and I wouldn't give a beaver skin for our scalps if we were to take the back trail to the settlements without arms in our hands. Besides that, we've among us the father of the gal who was stole far away off from Lake Champlain, and a relative of hers whose parents you've killed down on the lake. If we were to agree to give up our arms, it stands to reason it ain't likely they'd agree to give up the gals. No, no, chief, your terms aren't reasonable, but I tell you what we will do. If you will give us your word that neither you nor your tribe will molest us in our retreat, we'll go back to the settlements, and I'll engage that, When we get back there, we'll send you 9 of the best rifles money can buy, with plenty of powder and ball and blankets and such like." The chief waved his hand in contemptuous refusal of the terms. "There are 6 of my young men's scalps at your girdles, and their places are empty. War Eagle has spoken." "Very well, chief," Pearson said. "If nothing but scalps will content you, to fighting it must come. But I warn you that your tribe will lose a good many more afore they get ours." So saying, without another word, they separated, each party making their way back to their friends. "What on earth can he have proposed such terms as those for?" Harold asked, when Pearson had related what had taken place between him and the chief. "He must have known we should not accept them." "I expect," Pearson said, "he wanted to see who we were and to judge what sort of spirit we had. It may be, too, that there was a party among the tribe who had no stomachs for the job of attacking this place, and so he was obliged to make a show of offering terms to please him. But he never meant as they should be accepted. No, I'll take it they'll wait a few days to see what they'll hunger do. They must be pretty sure that we've not a very large supply of food." End of chapter 15. Recording by Chris Caron.
Chapter 16 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. True to the Old Flag by G.A. Henty. Chapter 16. The Great Storm. "Let us overhaul our packages," Harold said, "and see what provisions we have left. It would be as well to know how we stand." It was found that they had a sufficient supply of flour to last, with care, for a fortnight. The meal was nearly exhausted. Of tea they had an abundance. The sugar was nearly out, and they had 3 bottles of spirits. "Could we not make the flour last more than the 14 days by putting ourselves on half rations?" Harold asked. "We might do that," Peter said, "but I tell you the rations would be small even for 14 days. We've calculated according to how much we eat when we've plenty of meat, but without meat it would be only a starvation ration to each. Fortunately, we've fish hooks and lines, and by making holes in the ice we can get as many fish as we like. Well, we can live on them alone if need be, and an ounce or 2 of flour made into cakes will be enough to go with them. That way the flour would last us pretty nigh 2 months. I don't say that, if the worst come to the worst, we might not hold on right to the spring on fish. The lake's full of 'em, and some of them have so much oil in 'em that they're nigh as good as meat." "Do you think, Peter, that if the Indians make one great attack and are beaten off, they will try again?" "No one can say," Peter answered. "Injun nature can never be calculated on. I should say if they got a thundering beating they ain't likely to try again, but there's never no saying." "The sooner they attack and get it o'er the better," Cameron said. "I hanna slept a wink the last 2 nights. If I doze off for a moment I wake up, thinking I hear their yells. I'm as ready to fight as any of you when the time comes, but the thought of my daughter here makes me nervous and anxious. What do you say, Jake?" "It all the same to Jake, Massa Cameron. Jake sleeps berry sound, but he no like the thought of eating nothing but fish for 5 or 6 months. Jake nebber berry fond of fish." "You'll like it well enough when you get used to it, Jake," Pearson said. "It's not bad eating on a pinch, only you want to eat a sight of it to satisfy you. Well, let's see how the fish'll bite." 4 holes were cut in the ice at a short distance apart. The hooks were attached to strong lines and baited with deer's flesh, and soon the fishing began. The girls took great interest in the proceeding. Nellie was an adept at the sport, having generally caught the fish for the consumption of the household at home. She took charge of one of the lines, Harold of another, while Jake and one of the Senecas squatted themselves by the other holes. There had been some discussion as to whether the fishing should take place on the side of the island facing the shore or behind the rocks, but the former was decided upon. This was done because all were anxious that the expected attack should take place as soon as possible, and the event was likely to be hastened when the Indians saw that they were provided with lines and were thus able to procure food for a considerable time. It was soon manifest that, if they could live upon fish, they need feel no uneasiness as to its supply. Scarcely had the lines been let down than fish were fast to them. Harold and the other men soon had trout from 3 to 6 pounds lying on the ice beside them, but Nelly was obliged to call Pearson to her assistance, and the fish, when brought to the surface, was found to be over 20 pounds in weight. An hour's fishing procured them a sufficient supply for a week's consumption. There was no fear as to the fish keeping, for in a very short time after being drawn from the water they were frozen stiff and hard. They were hung up to some boughs near the huts, and the party were glad enough to get into shelter again, for the cold was intense. As before, the early part of the night passed quietly, but toward morning Peter, who was on watch, ran down and awakened the others. "Get your shooting irons and hurry up," he said. "The varmints are coming this time in earnest." In a minute every one was at the post assigned to him. A number of dark figures could be seen coming over the ice. "There's nigh 200 of 'em," Peter said. "War Eagle has brought the whole strength of his tribe." Contrary to their usual practice, the Indians did not attempt to crawl up to the place they were about to attack, but advanced at a run across the ice. The defenders lost not a moment in opening fire, for some of their rifles would carry as far as the shore. "Shoot steady," Peter said. "Don't throw away a shot." Each man loaded and fired as quickly as he could, taking a steady aim, and the dark figures which dotted the ice behind the advancing Indians showed that the fire was an effectual one. The Indians did not return a shot. Their chief had, no doubt, impressed upon them the uselessness of firing against men lying in shelter, and had urged them to hurry at the top of their speed to the island and crush the whites in a hand-to-hand fight. It was but 3 or 4 minutes from the time the first shot was fired before they were close to the island. They made, as Peter had expected, toward the little cove, which was indeed the only place at which a landing could well be effected. Harold ran down and hid himself in a bush at the spot where the train terminated, carrying with him a glowing brand from the fire. "War Eagle means to have our scalps this time," Peter said to Pearson. "I never seed an uglier rush. White man couldn't have done better." The Indians had run in scattered order across the ice, but they closed up as they neared the cove. As they rushed toward it, 4 fell beneath the shots of half the defenders, and another 4 a few seconds later from a volley by the other section. In a wonderfully short time the first were ready again, and the Indians wavered at the slaughter and opened fire upon the breastwork, behind which the defenders were crouching. Those behind pressed on, and, with terrific yells, the mass of Indians bounded forward. Harold had remained inactive, crouching behind the bush. He saw the head of the dark mass rush past him, and then applied the brand to the train. There was a tremendous explosion. Yells and screams rent the air, and in an instant a dark line of water, 20 feet wide, stretched across the mouth of the cove. In this were pieces of floating ice, and numbers of Indians struggling and yelling. Some made only a faint struggle before they sank, while others struck out for the side furthest from the island. The main body of the Indians, appalled by the explosion, checked themselves in their course, and at once took to flight. Some, unable to check their impetus, fell into the water upon the wounded wretches who were struggling there. Those who had crossed stood irresolute, and then, turning, leaped into the water. As they struggled to get out on the opposite side, the defenders maintained a deadly fire upon them. But in 2 or 3 minutes the last survivor had scrambled out, and all were in full flight toward the shore. "I think we've seen the last of the attacks," Peter said, as they came down from their breastwork and joined Harold in the cove. "That was a first-rate notion of yours, lad. If it hadn't been for that, we should have been rubbed out, sure enough. Another minute and we'd have gone down. They were in earnest and no mistake. They'd got steam up and was determined to finish with us at once, whatever it cost them." The instant the attack had ceased, Cameron had hastened to the hut where the girls were lying, to assure them that all danger was over and that the Indians were entirely defeated. In an hour a fresh skim of ice had formed across the streak of water, but, as through its clear surface many of the bodies of the Indians could be seen, the men threw snow over it, to spare the girls the unpleasantness of such a sight every time they went out from the cove. The bodies of all the Indians who had fallen near the island were also covered with snow. Those nearer the shore were carried off by the Iroquois in their retreat. "I suppose, Peter," Harold said as they sat round the fire that evening, "you have been in quite as awkward scrapes as this before and have got out all right." "Why, this business ain't nothing to that affair we had by Lake Champlain. That were as bad a business, when we were surrounded in that log hut, as ever I went through, and I've been through a good many. Pearson and me nigh got our hair raised more than once in that business of Pontiac's. He were a great chief, and managed to get up the biggest confederation against that's ever been known. It were well for us that that business didn't begin a few years earlier when we was fighting the French. But you see, so long as we and they was at war, the Indians hoped as we might pretty well exterminate each other, and then they'd intended to come in and finish off whoever got the best of it. Well, the English they drove the French back, and finally a treaty was made in Europe by which the French agreed to clear out. It was just about this time as Pontiac worked upon the tribes to lay aside their own quarrels and join the French in fighting against us. He got the Senecas and the Delawares and the Shawnees, the Wyandots, and a lot of other tribes from the lakes and the hill country between the Niagara River and the Mississippi. Jack Pearson and me, we happened to be with the Miamis when the bloody belt which Pontiac were sending round as a signal for war arrived at the fort there. Jack and me knew the Redskins pretty well, and saw by their manner as something unusual had happened. I went to the commandant of the fort and told him as much. He didn't think much of my news. The soldier chaps always despises the Redskins till they see 'em come yelling along with their tomahawks, and then as often as not it's just the other way. Howsomever, he agreed at last to pay any amount of trade goods I might promise to the Miamis if the news turned out worth finding out. I discovered that a great palaver was to be held that evening at the chief's village, which was a mile away from the fort. I'd seen a good deal of the Miamis and had fought with them against the Shawnees, so I could do as much with them as most. Off Pearson and I goes to the chief, and I says to him, "Look here, chief, I've good reasons to believe you've got a message from Pontiac and that it means trouble. Now don't you go and let yourself be led away by him. I've heard rumours that he's getting up a great confederation against the English. But I tell you, chief, if all the Redskins on this continent was to join together, they couldn't do nothing against the English. I don't say as you mightn't wipe out a number of little border forts, for no doubt you might, but what would come of it? England would send out as many men as there are leaves in the forest, who would scorch up the Redskin nations as a fire on the prairie scorches up the grass. I tell you, chief, no good can come on it. Don't build your hopes on the French. They have acknowledged that they're beaten and are all going out of the country. It'd be best for you and your people to stick to the English. They can reward their friends handsomely, and if you join with Pontiac, sooner or later trouble and ruin will come upon you. Now I can promise you, in the name of the officer of the fort, a good English rifle for yourself and 50 guns for your braves, and 10 bales of blankets, if you'll make a clean breast of it, and first tell us what deviltry Pontiac is up to, and next join us freely, or anyway hold aloof altogether from this conspiracy till you see how things is going." Well, the chief he thought the matter over, and said he'd do his best at the palaver that night, but till that was over, and he knew what the council decided on, he couldn't tell me what the message was. I was pretty well satisfied, for Prairie Dog were a great chief in his tribe, and I felt pretty certain he'd get the council to go the way he wanted. I told him I'd be at the fort, and that the governor would expect a message after the council was over. It was past midnight when the chief came with 4 of his braves. He told us that the tribe had received a bloody belt from Pontiac, and a message that the Mingos and Delawares, the Wyandots and Shawnees were going to dig up the hatchet against the whites, and calling upon him and his people to massacre the garrison of the fort, and then march to join Pontiac, who was about to fall upon Detroit and Fort Pitt. They were directed to send the belt on to the tribes on the Wabash, but they loved the English, and were determined to take no part against them. So they delivered the belt to their friend the white commander, and hoped that he'd tell the great king in England that the Miamis were faithful to him. The governor highly applauded their conduct, and said he'd send the news to the English governor at New York, and at once ordered the presents which I promised to be delivered to the chief for himself and his braves. When they'd gone, he said, "You're right, Peter. This news is important indeed, and it's clear that a terrible storm's about to bust upon the frontier. Whether the Miamis will keep true is doubtful, but now I'm on my guard, they'll find it difficult to take the fort. But the great thing is to carry the news of what's happened to Detroit, to put them on their guard. Will you and Pearson start at once?" In course we agreed, though it was clear that the job was a risksome one, for it wouldn't be no easy matter to journey through the woods with the whole Redskin tribes on the warpath. The commander wanted me to carry the belt with me, but I said I might just as well carry my death warrant to the first Redskins I come across. Major Gladwin, who commanded at Detroit, knew me, and I didn't need to carry any proof of my story. So, afore the Miamis had been gone half an hour, Jack and me took the trail for Detroit. We had got a canoe hid on the lake a few miles away, and we was soon on board. The next morning we seed a whole fleet of canoes coming down the lake. We might have made a race with them, but being fully manned, the chances was as they'd have cut us off. and seeing that at present war had not been declared, we judged it best to seem as if we were interfered. So we paddles up to them, and found as they were a lot of Wyandots, whose hunting grounds lay up by Lake Superior. In course I didn't ask no questions as to where they was going, but just mentioned as we was on our way down to Detroit. We're going that way too, the chief said, and they'll be glad to have our white brothers with us. So we paddled along together until about noon they landed. Nothing was said to us as how we were prisoners, but we could see as how we was just as much captives as if we'd been tied with buckskin ropes. Jack and me talked it over, and agreed as it was no matter of use trying to make our escape, but that as long as they chose to treat us as guests, we'd best seem perfectly contented, and make no show of considering as they was on the warpath, although, seeing as they had no women or children with them, a baby could have known as they were up to no good. The next morning they started again at daybreak, and after paddling some hours, landed and hid away their canoes and started on foot. Nothing was said to us, but we saw, as we was expected to do as they did. We went on till we was within 10 mile of Detroit, and then we halted. I thought it were best to find out exactly how we stood, so Jack and I goes up to the chief, and says that as we was near Detroit, we would just say good-bye to him and tramp in. Why should my white brothers hurry? He said. It is not good for them to go on alone, for the woods are very full of Indians. But, I said, the hatchet's buried between the whites and the redskins, so there's no danger in the woods. The chief waved his hand. My white brothers have joined the Wyandots, and they will tarry with them until they go into Detroit. There are many redskins there, and there will be a grand palaver. The Wyandots will be present. Jack and me made no signs of being dissatisfied, but the position weren't a pleasant one, I can tell you. Here was the redskins a-clustering like bees around Detroit, ready to fall upon the garrison and massacre them, and we, who was the only man as knew of the danger, was prisoners among the redskins. It was certain, too, that though they mightn't take our lives till they had attacked the garrison, they was only keeping us for the pleasure of torturing us quietly afterwards. The situation was plain enough. The question was, what were to be done? There was about 60 of the varmints around us, sitting by their fires, and looking as if they didn't even know as we was there, but we knew as sharp eyes was watching us, and that, afore we'd gone 5 yards, the whole lot would be on our track. Jack and me didn't say much to each other, for we knew how closely we was watched, and didn't want them to think as we was planning our escape. So after a few words we sat down by one of the fires till it got time to lie down for the night. But we both been a-thinking. We saw when we lay down that the Injuns lay pretty well around us, while 2 on 'em, with their rifles ready to hand, sat down by a fire close by and threw on some logs, as if they intended to watch all night. It was a goodish-sized clearing as they chose for a camping ground, and we should have had to run some distance afore we got to the shelter of the trees. The moon, too, was up, and it were well nigh as light as day, and anxious as we was to get away, we agreed that there were no chance of sliding off, but that it'd be better to wait till next day. When we woke, our guns was gone. We complained to the chief, who said coldly that his young men would carry the guns and give 'em back to us when we got to Detroit. It were no use saying more, for he might at any moment have ordered us to be bound, and it were better to keep the use of our legs as long as we could. For 2 days we stayed there, not seeing the shadow of a chance of getting away. Several redskin runners come in and spoke to the chief, and we got more and more anxious to be off. We was still allowed to walk about, provided we didn't go near the edge of the clearing. Whenever we went that way, 2 Injuns, who kept guard by turns over us, shouted to us to go no further. The 3rd morning, after a runner had come in, the chief gave the word for a move, and we set out. We saw they wasn't taking the direct line to Detroit, although still going in that direction, and after 2 hours marching through the woods, we got down onto the Detroit River. Here was a big encampment, and some 300 or 400 Shawnees and Delawares was gathered there. A chief come up to us as we entered the open. He gave an order to the Wyandots, and in a minute we was bound hand and foot, carried to a small wigwam, and chucked down inside like 2 logs of wood. After a little talk, Jack and I agreed as after all we had a better chance of escaping now than when we was watched by a whole tribe, and we concluded that there weren't no time to be lost. The Wyandots had no doubt been brought up in readiness to strike the blow, and even if we'd known nothing about the belt, we'd have been sure that mischief was intended when these 3 bands of red varmints had gathered so close to the fort. It was certain we couldn't do nothing till night, but we both strained our cords as much as possible to get 'em to stretch a bit and give us a better chance of slipping out of them. No one come near us for some time, and as we could hear the sound of voices, we guessed that a great council was taking place, and we agreed at once to loosen the knots so as to be in readiness for work, as like enough they'd put a sentry over it at night. It was a risky thing to try, for we might be disturbed at any minute. Still, we thought it were our only chance, so Jack set to work with his teeth at my knots, and in a quarter of an hour had loosened them. Then I undone his. We unbound our thongs, and then fastened them up again, so that to the eye they looked just the same as before, but really with a jerk they'd fall off. I must teach you how to do that, Harold, some time. You may find it of use. The knots was tied up as tightly as before, and it would have needed a close examination to see that we was not tied as ever. Not a word was spoken, and we was as quiet as mice, for we could hear 2 redskins talking outside. You may guess we was pretty slick about it, and I don't know as ever I felt so thankful as when we laid ourselves down again, just as we'd been throwed, without the slit in the tent having opened and a red face peered in. A quarter of an hour later a redskin come in and looked at us. Seeing, as it seemed to him, as we hadn't moved, he went out again. Just before nightfall 2 on 'em came in together, rolled us over, and looked at the knots. They found as these was all right. Then one sat down just in the door of the tent, and the other took his place outside. We waited some hours. At last the fires burned low and the camp got quiet. We knew it was well nigh hopeless to wait for 'em all to be asleep, for redskin nature is a restless one, and especially when there's anything on hand, they'll turn out 2 or 3 times in a night to smoke their pipes by the fires, and they'd be the more restless since, as we'd seen, there was only 4 or 5 wigwams, and all would be sleeping on the ground. At last I thought the time were come, and gave Jack a nudge, and we both sat up. It were a ticklish moment, young un, I can tell you, for we knew that it were scarce possible to get off without the alarm being raised. If the wigwam had stood close to the edge of the forest, it would have been comparatively easy, for once among the trees we might have hoped to have outrun 'em, though the moon was so pesky bright. But unfortunately it was built not far from the river, and we should have to cross the whole clearing to gain the woods. The chances weren't good, I can tell you, but it was clear as we'd had to try 'em. We had purposely moved about pretty often, so that our movements would not attract the attention of the Injun now. It didn't take a minute to slip out of the cords, which, tight as they looked, really were not fastened at all, there being 2 loose double ends between our arms and our bodies. We could see the outside sentry through the open door, and we waited till he turned his back and looked out on the river. Then suddenly I gripped the redskin sitting at the entrance by the neck with both my hands, pretty tight as you may reckon, and Jack catched his knife from his belt and buried it in his body. That was soon over, and not a sound made as would have startled a mouse. Then, standing up, I made a spring onto the sentry, while Jack used his knife as before. We let him drop softly down and prepared to bolt, when of a sudden the war-whoop sounded not 20 feet away. One of the redskins, finding the ground hard, I suppose, was strolling up to speak to the sentry when he saw us tackle him. For a moment he were too much surprised to holler, but when he did, he gave a yell as brought the whole tribe to their feet. Jack had taken up the sentry's rifle. "You'd better have held your tongue," he said, as he levelled on the redskin, and before the whoop was out of his lips, the bullet hit him, and he went down like a log. He didn't need to look round to see as there was no chance of getting to the trees, for 200 redskins was between us and them. "We must take to the river, Jack," I said. It were but 30 yards away. I expected every moment, as we run, to hear the rifle bullets whistle round us, but I guess Pontiac had given orders that no gun was to be fired lest it might be heard at the fort. Anyhow, not a shot was fired, and we got down safe to the bank. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caron. True to the Old Flag by G. A. Henty. Chapter 17. The Scout's Story. Luckily enough, there was a canoe lying close at our feet. "Shove it out, Jack," says I, "and then keep along the bank." We gave it a shove with all our strength, and sent it dancing out into the river. Then we dived in and swum down close under the bank. There was bushes growing all along, and we came up each time under 'em. The redskins was some little distance behind us as we reached the river, and in course thought we had throwed ourselves flat in the canoe. In a minute or two they got another and paddled off to it, and we soon heard the shout they raised when they found it was empty. By this time we was 100 yards below the spot where we had taken to the water, and knowing as they would be off along the bank and would find us in no time, we scrambled straight up and made for the trees. We was within 50 yards of the edge of the forest, and none of the redskins was near us, as the whole body had clustered down at the spot where we had jumped in. We hadn't fairly set foot on the bank afore they saw us, and, with a whoop which sometimes wakes me even now in my sleep, and makes me sit up with a sweat on my forehead, they started. I could run faster than I can now, and ye may guess I went my best. We plunged into the trees and went as hard as we could foot it, the redskins being 50 or 60 yards behind. Our hope was to find a place with a thickish underwood. It was darker a deal under the trees than in the clearing, still it was not dark enough to hide us from redskin eyes. We run straight, for we knew they could see us, and arter about 400 yards we come upon a place where the undergrowth grew thick, where we began to dodge 'em, turning now one way and now another, keeping always low in the bushes. They had lost us by sight now, but there was so many of 'em that we pretty nigh despaired of getting through. Some of 'em had tried to follow us, but the best part had run straight on for a bit, and then, when sure they had headed us, scattered right and left, so that they were ahead of us now as well as on our traces, and we could hear 'em shouting all around us. So we did the only thing there was to be done, and made the best of our way back to the clearing, keeping low and taking good care not to cross any patch where the moonlight through the trees fell on the ground. It were lucky for us that it was a camp of braves. Had it been an ordinary redskin encampment there would have been squaws and boys and wuss still dogs who would have seed us the moment we got back. But being all braves on the warpath, the whole gang had started arter us, and not a soul had remained in the clearing. We did not rest there long, you may be sure, but made straight down the water. There we picked out a canoe, crossed the river, and got into the shade of the trees the other side. Then we kept along down it till we got close to the fort of Detroit. We could see a good many smoldering fires out afore it, and guessed that a strong body of redskins, pretending to be friends, had a camp there. We made round them and reached the gate of the fort safe. The sentries wouldn't let us in, but when a sergeant was fetched it turned out as he knew us, seeing that we had been scouting out from thar in the summer. Pretty thankful he was when the gate closed arter us. Our news would keep, so we waited till morning, afore we saw the major, and then told him the whole history of the matter, and how Pontiac had raised all the tribes east of the Mississippi against us. We found that Pontiac has been into the camp with 50 of his warriors 3 days afore, professing great friendship, and had said that in 2 or 3 days he would call again and pay a formal visit. Detroit then was but a trading post, defended by a stockade 20 feet high and 1,200 yards in circumference. About 50 houses of traders and storekeepers stood within it. The garrison was composed of 120 men of the 18th Regiment and 8 officers. They had 3 guns, 2 6-pounders, and 3 powder, and 3 mortars, but their carriages was so old and rotten that they was of no real service. 2 vessels mounting some small guns lay in the river off the fort. The governor was a good soldier, but he was naturally started at hearing that there was something like 1,000 redskins in the woods round. But he said that now he had warning he was not afraid of 'em. A messenger was set off in a canoe to carry the tidings east and to ask for reinforcements, and the traders was all told to get their arms ready. At 8 o'clock in the morning Pontiac was seen a-coming with 300 warriors. There had been no declaration of war, and the redskins was supposed to be friendly, so the major didn't like to be the first to commence hostilities, as folks who knew nothing of it might likely enough have raised an outcry about massacring the poor Injuns. Howsomever, he called all the troops under arms and disposed them behind the houses. The traders, too, with their rifles, were drawn up ready. The gates was opened when Pontiac arrived, and he and his warriors entered. They had left their rifles behind them, as they pretended that their mission was a peaceful one, but they had all got their tomahawks and knives under the blankets. They advanced in a body toward where Major Gladwin and his officers was standing in front of his quarters. Jack and me and 2 or 3 scouts who happened to be in the fort stood just behind, careless-like with our rifles, so that in any case of any sudden attack we could keep them back for a moment or two. I noticed that Pontiac carried in his hand a wampum belt. I noticed it because it was green on one side and white on the other, and it turned out afterward that when he twisted that belt with 2 hands it was to be the signal for an attack. Pontiac spoke soft for a time. He was a fine redskin, that can't be denied. He was a Catawba by birth, but had been adopted into the tribe of Ottawas, and had risen to be their chief. He were a great brave, and one of the best speakers I ever heard. He was a wise chief, as you may guess by the way he got all the tribes to lay aside their private quarrels and make common cause against us. I watched him close. He kept his eyes on the major and spoke as cool and as calm as if he had nothing on his mind, but I could see the warrior glancing about, wondering no doubt what had become of the soldiers. Presently the chief changed his tone and began to pretend as he was in a rage at some grievance or another. The major just put his whistle to his lips, and in a moment from behind the houses the soldiers and traders marched out, rifle in hand. You never saw a more disgusted crew than them redskins. I'll do Pontiac justice to say that he never so much as moved, but just went on talking as if he hadn't noticed the troops at all. The major answered him in the same way, and after half an hour's talk the redskins went out again, without so much as a knife having been shown. Major Gladwin gave Jack and me papers testifying as how we had saved Detroit from destruction, and sent an account of it to Governor Amherst, and to this day Jack and me draw special pensions for that air business, besides what we earned as British scouts. "That was an adventure, Peter," Harold said. "They did not take Detroit after all, did they?" "No, we beat 'em off handsome when they tried it. Then they laid siege to Fort Pitt, and tried very hard there, too. But the place held out till some troops who had come up marched out from here and raised the siege. At some of the little places they succeeded. Lots of settlers was massacred. At Fort Sandusky, Edson Pauley and the garrison was massacred by a party of Hurons and Ottawas, who come in as friends. This was on the same day as they had intended to do for us at Detroit. At St. Joseph's, an English ensign with 14 soldiers was killed by the Potawatomis, but nowhere did Pontiac obtain any real successes. The French in Illinois were preparing to leave, and he couldn't get no assistance from them. After the siege of Fort Pitt was raised, peace was patched up again. Pontiac's Confederacy, finding as they hadn't got none of the successes he promised them, was beginning to break up, and the English saw no chance of doing any good by hunting the redskins among the forests, so both parties was willing for peace. Pontiac never gave any more trouble, and some years arterward, coming into one of the towns, he was killed by an Injun, who had a private grudge agin him. And now I'm longing for a quiet pipe, and you'd better turn in. There's no saying whether we'll have a quiet night of it." A fortnight passed without further incident. Then the sky became overcast, and Peter and the Indians agreed that snow would soon fall. All hands were at once set to work to make up their stores into packages. The deerskins and blankets were tied in bundles. Besides these, there were only 2 kegs of powder and about 200 pounds of frozen fish. Harold was in high glee at the thought that their imprisonment was to come to an end, although there was no doubt that the attempt would be a hazardous one, as the backwoodsmen were sure that the instant the snow began to fall the Indians would be out in great numbers round the island to prevent the defenders taking advantage of the storm. Several times Harold observed the 2 backwoodsmen talking to the Seneca chief and looking at the sky, as he thought that their countenances expressed some anxiety. "What is it, Peter?" he asked at length. "Don't you think we shall have a snowstorm?" "We may have now," Peter said, "but I think it's more than a snowstorm that's coming. The clouds are flying past, very fast, and it seems to me as if we're in for a big gale of wind." But that will drift the snow and cover our footsteps almost as well as a snowstorm, Harold said. Yes, it'll do all that, the scout answered. What's the objection to it, Peter? In the first place, lad, if it don't snow, we may stop where we are, for there'd be no chance of getting through the Injuns unless it snowed so thick you couldn't see 5 feet away. It'll be difficult enough, anyhow. There'll be 400 or 500 of the varmints out, for they'll bring even their boys with 'em, so as to form a pretty close line round the island. Our only chance'll be for the Senecas to go first, and to silence, afore they can give the alarm, any they might meet in our line. That might be done in a heavy snowstorm, but without snow it would be impossible. In the next place, even if we got through 'em, we'd have to carry our canoe." "Why?" Harold asked, surprised. "What good could the canoe be to us, with the lake frozen hard?" "You see, the wind is on the shore here, lad, and when it does blow on these lakes, it blows fit to take the har off your head. It's as much as a man do to make way agin it, and I doubt whether the gals should face it, even with our help. As to carrying a canoe in its teeth, it couldn't be done. But why carry the canoe at all, Peter? That's what I cannot understand." "Wall, you see, lad, the force of the wind acting on sech a big sheet of ice will move it, and like enough you'd see it piled up in a bank 40 feet high on this side of the lake, and there'll be a strip of clear water half a mile wide on the other. That's why we must take the canoe." Harold was silent. In the face of such a probability, it was clear that they must encumber themselves with the canoe. The provision of the scout proved well founded. Before evening the wind was blowing with tremendous force. Small flakes of snow were driven before it, inflicting stinging blows on the face and eyes of those who ventured out of the shelter. As it became dark, the lookout announced that he could see large numbers of Indians starting from the shore at some distance to the right and left of them, showing that the redskins were fully alive to the possibility of garrison of the island taking advantage of the storm, which would hide their trail to effect their escape. Every hour the fury of the gale increased, and it was unanimously agreed that until it diminished it would be impossible for the girls, and for men carrying a canoe, to face it. 2 men were placed on watch at the mouth of the cove, where mines similar to the first had been sunk in the ice in a semicircle some little distance outside that before exploded. This precaution had been taken on the day succeeding the great repulse of the enemy, although the scouts felt assured that the attempt would not be repeated. But it was thought possible that the Indians might toward morning, if they found the whites did not attempt to pass them, take advantage of the storm to attempt a surprise. After it became dark, Cameron and Harold, as was their custom, went into the girls' hut to chat until it was time to turn in. The deerskin and blankets had again been unrolled, and the covering of snow kept the interior warm in spite of the storm without. "What is that noise?" Nelly asked in a pause of the conversation. "I don't know," Harold answered. "I have heard it for some time." All were silent, intent upon listening. Even above the fury of the gale a dull grinding sound, with occasional crashes, could be heard. "I think it must be ice," Harold said. "I will go out and see." On issuing from the hut he was for a time blinded by the force of the wind and the flying particles of snow. The din was tremendous. He made his way with difficulty in the teeth of the storm to the edge of the rocks. Then he started in surprise. A great bank of cakes and fragments of ice was heaped up against the wall of the rock, crashing and grinding against each other as they were pressed onward by fresh additions from beyond. Already the bank was nearly level with the top of the rock, and some of the vast blocks, 2 feet in thickness, had been thrust onto it. The surface of the lake beyond was no longer a brilliant white. Every particle of snow had been swept away, and the dull gray of the rough ice lay unbroken. He made his way at once to the hut of the men, and just as he reached the entrance Peter, who had also been out to reconnoiter, came up, and before Harold had turned to speak he put his head into the hut. "Turn out," he said. "I tell ye we're in fix. This ain't no common gale. I don't know as ever as I've been in a worse one."
"What's the use of turning out?" Pearson asked. "We can't do nothing, and it's warmer here a sight than it is outside. I tell ye you've got to go. The ice is breaking up fast, and it's level with the top of the island already. Unless, if I'm mistaken, there'll be a 40 foot of ice piled under this island afore an hour." This was indeed alarming news, and in a minute the occupants of the hut were all in the open air. "You can call in your scouts, Seneca. There ain't no fear of an attack to-night. No mortal soul, not even an Injun, could stand the force of the wind out on the lake." A very short examination sufficient to show the truth of Peter's anticipations. Already the upper part of the bank was sliding over the rock, and it was clear that in a very short time the whole world would be covered. "What is to be done, Peter?" Harold shouted. "We must take to the canoe. There's clear water on the other side." Harold crossed the island and saw that what Peter said was correct. A broad strip of black water stretched away in the darkness toward the shore. The whole ice sheet was moving bodily before the wind, and as the island stood up in its course, the ice was to windward of it was forced up over it, while under its lee the lake was clear. Not a moment was lost. The canoe was got out, carried over the rocks, and carefully lowered into the water under shelter of the island. All the stores and provisions were lowered into it. A deerskin was spread on the bottom, and the girls, having been helped down into the boat, were told to lie down and were then covered with blankets. The men wrapped themselves up in skins and blankets, and took their places with the canoe, the 4 Indians taking paddles. Quickly as the preparations had been made, there were but a few feet of the island uncovered by the ice, as the last man descended into the boat, and they pushed off, and, after a couple of strokes, lay with the boat's head facing toward the island at a distance of 50 yards from it. Although somewhat sheltered from the wind, the Indians were obliged to paddle hard to maintain their position. Harold wondered at first that they had not kept closer to the island, but he soon understood their reason for keeping at a distance. The massive block of ice, pressed forward by the irresistible force behind, began to shoot from the top of the island into the water, gliding far on beneath the surface with the impetus of the fall, and then shooting up again with a force which would have destroyed the canoe at once had they touched it. Soon a perfect cataract of ice was falling. Peter and Pearson took their places on each side of the canoe, with poles to push off the pieces as they drifted before the gale toward the shore. The work required the utmost strength and care. One touch from the sharp-edged blocks would have ripped open the side of the bark canoe like a knife, and in the icy cold water, encumbered by floating fragments of ice, even the best swimmer could not have gained the solid ice. The peril was great, and it needed all the strength and activity of the white men, and the skill of the paddlers, to avoid the danger which momentarily threatened them. So quickly did the blocks float down upon them that Pearson thought it might be impossible to avoid them all. The skins, therefore, were hung round the boat, dropping some inches into the water, and these, although they could not have prevented the boat from being stove in by the larger fragments, yet protected its side from the contact of the smaller ones. For upward of an hour the struggle continued, and Harold felt something like despair, and at the thought of a long night passed in such a struggle. Presently sounds like the booming of cannon were heard above the gale. "What is that?" he shouted to Seneca Chief, next to whom he was sitting. "Ice break up," the chief replied. "Break up altogether." This proved to be the case. As the ice was driven away from the further side of the lake, the full force of the wind played upon the water there, and as the streak widened, a heavy sea soon got up. The force of the swell extended under the ice, aiding the effect of the wind above, and the vast sheet began to break up. The reports redoubled in strength, and frequently the ice was seen to heave and swell. Then, with a sound like thunder, it broke, and great cakes were forced one on top of the other, and soon, instead of a level plain of ice, a chaos of blocks were tossing about on the waves. Harold watched the charge with anxiety. No longer was the channel on either side marked by regular defined lines, but floating pieces encroached upon it, and, looking toward the shore, the channel appeared to be altogether lost. The danger was overwhelming, but the Indians, paddling with increased strength, urged the boat forward until within a few yards of the island. A few minutes before such an approach would have assured the immediate destruction of the boat, but Harold saw with surprise that almost simultaneously with the breaking up of the ice sheet the fall of blocks from the island had ceased. A moment's reflection showed him the reason of his phenomenon. With the break-up of ice, held the pressure from behind had suddenly ceased. No longer were the blocks piled on the island, pushed forward by the tremendous pressure of the ice field. The torrent was stayed, and they could approach the island with safety. As soon as they were assured that this was so, the canoe was brought close to the rocks. Pearson leaped ashore, climbed the rocks and the ice piled 20 feet above them, and with this pole convinced himself that at this point there were no loose blocks likely to fall. Having satisfied himself on this head, he descended again and took his place in the boat. This was moored by a rope a few feet long to a bush growing from a fissure in the rock close to the water's edge. He and Peter remained on watch with their poles to fend off any pieces of ice which might be brought round by the waves, while the rest of the crew, wrapping themselves up in their blankets, lay down at the bottom of the boat. The next morning the storm still raged, and the lake presented the appearance of an angry sea. Sheltered under the lee of the island, the party were protected from its effects. Although the light canoe rose and fell on the heavy swell, the ice had wholly disappeared from the lake, and the pieces, having been ground to atoms against each other in the storm. Along the line of shore there was a great bank of ice as high as the tree tops. "The ways of the Lord are wonderful," Duncan Cameron said. "The storm which threatened to be our destruction has proved our salvation. When it abates we shall be able to paddle down the lake without fear of interruption." "Yes," Peter said, "the varmints are not likely to follow us, in the first place, unless they thought of taking their canoes into the forest when the storm first began, which ain't likely, as they was a-thinking only of cutting off our escape. They'd been smashed into tinder. In the second place, they couldn't catch us if they had canoes, for as we've 8 paddles, counting them we made out of the seats, then we was on shore, we'd be able to laugh at them. And lastly, they've had such a taste of the equality of our rifles that, even if they had a dozen canoes on hand, I doubt if they'd care to attack us. No, sir. When this storm's over we have nothing to do but paddle down to the settlements at the other end of the lake." Toward the afternoon the storm abated, and next morning the sun was shining brilliantly, and the waves had gone down sufficiently to enable the canoe to start on her voyage. "Now, boys," Pearson said cheerfully, "if you don't want to get froze up again, you best be sharp, for I can tell you about 36 hours of this weather, and the lake'll be solid again." 5 minutes later the canoe with its 8 sturdy paddlers started on its way, speeding like an arrow from an ice-covered island which had done them such good service in their greatest need. "Now, Jake," Peter said, "the more strength you put into that paddle of yourn, sooner you'll have a piece of meat atween your jaws." The negro grinned. "Don't talk of him, Massa Peter. Don't say a word about him until I see him. Fish berry good when dere's nothing else to eat, but Jake never want to see him again. He have eat quite enough for the rest of his life." Cameron, who was not accustomed to the use of the paddle, sat in the stem with the 2 girls, but the others were all accused to the exercise, and the boat literally bounded along at each stroke from the sinewy arms, and by nightfall they had reached the opposite shore. After some hours' work together 2 of them had rested, and from that time they took it by turns, 6 paddles being kept constantly going. Without any adventure they arrived safely at the end of the lake. The clearing where Nellie had lived so long, and where her father and mother had been killed, was passed in the night, much to Harold's satisfaction, as he was afraid that he would have been terribly upset at the many sad memories which the sight of the place could not but call up. On their way down they had seen many gasps in the forest, caused by the gale, but it was not until they reached their landing place that the full effect of its destructive force was visible. Several scows and other boats lay wrecks upon the shore. Every house in the little village was leveled to the ground. The orchards were ruined, palings and fences torn down, and the whole place strewn with fragments. A few people were moving among the ruins. They gazed with a dull apathy among the newcomers, apparently dazed by the misfortune that had befallen them. Harold learned, on questioning them, that 27 persons had been killed, and the majority of the survivors more or less seriously injured. With the exception of the few whom they saw, about all the survivors had been taken off to the town in boats down the river, or in wagons lent by neighbors whose villages, sheltered in the woods, had escaped the ravages of the gale. After a few hours' halt, having obtained meat and other stores, they proceeded on their way to Detroit. Here Nellie had several friends, who had long believed her to have fallen at the massacre at the farm. By them she was gladly received, and she took up her abode in a family with some daughters of her own age. Harold found that there was a considerable sum of money in the bank in her father's name, and from this, after a consultation with her, a sum of money sufficient to provide the Seneca and his followers with blankets, powder, and Indian finery for years was drawn and bestowed upon them. A day or two afterward the Indians left for their own country, highly gratified with the success of the expedition and proud of the numerous scalps which hung from each of their girdles. Harold learned that there was but little fighting going on along the Canadian frontier. The winter had set in again with extreme severity. The St. Lawrence would be frozen, and he would have no means of leaving Canada. He was therefore well content to settle down until the spring at Detroit, where he received numerous and hearty invitations to stay for any time from the various friends of his cousins. Jake, of course, remained with him. Peter went up to Montreal, where he had some relatives residing, Harold promising to call for him on his way east in the spring. Pearson, after a few days' stay in Detroit, started again with a comrade on a hunting expedition. Caron and his daughter also spent the winter at Detroit. The months passed very pleasantly to Harold. Since the war began he had had no period of rest or quiet, and he now entered with zest into the various amusements, sleighing and dancing, which helped to while away the long winter in America. He also joined in many hunting parties, for in those days game abounded up to the very edge of the clearings. Moose were abundant, and the hunt of these grand deer was full of excitement. Except when the snow is on the ground, these animals can defy their pursuers, but the latter with their snowshoes go lightly over the frozen snow, in which the moose sink heavily. There were many discussions as to the future of Nellie. Several of her friends would gladly have adopted her as a member of their family, but Harold warmly urged that she would go to England and take up her abode with his mother, who was her nearest relative, and Nellie, somewhat to the surprise of her friends, finally agreed to this proposal. A purchaser was readily found for the farm, which was an excellent one, and the proceeds of the sale, with the amount of savings in the bank, gave her a little fortune of some £2,500. When the spring came and the navigation of the lake was open, Harold, Nellie, the Camerons, and Jake started in a ship for Montreal. There they joined by Peter and sailed down to Quebec, where Nellie and the Camerons took passage for England. Very deep was the gratitude which Duncan expressed to the friends who had restored his daughter to him. He had had enough of the colonies, and intended to spend the rest of his life among his own people in Scotland. Harold, Peter, and Jake sailed to join the English army in the south. End of chapter 17. Recording by Chris Caron.
Chapter 18 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. True to the Old Flag by G. A. Henty. Chapter 18. The Siege of Savannah. After the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga, the English Parliament made another effort to obtain peace, and passed an act renouncing all rights to tax the colonists, and yielding every point as to which they had been in dispute. Commissioners were sent over with full authority to treat, and had the colonists been ready nominally to submit to England, a virtual independence, similar to that possessed by Canada and the Australian colonies at the present time, would have been granted. As a very large body of the Americans had from the first been desirous of coming to terms, and as the paralyzed state of trade caused great and general distress, It is probable that these terms might have been accepted had it not been for the intervention of France. That power had all along encouraged the rebellion. She had smarted under the loss of Canada, and although her rule in her own colonies was far more arbitrary than that of England in America, she was glad to assist in any movement which could operate to the disadvantage of this country. Hitherto, nominally she had remained neutral, but now, fearing that the offers of the English would induce the colonists to make peace, she came forward, recognized their independence, and engaged herself to furnish a large fleet for their assistance. The colonists joyfully accepted the offer, seeing that the intervention of France in the struggle would completely alter its conditions. Heretofore the British had been enabled to send over men and stores at will, but were they blockaded by a French fleet, their difficulties would be immensely increased. As there had been no cause of quarrel between England and France, this agreement was an act of wanton hostility on the part of the latter. On obtaining information of the signature of the treaty between France and the colonies, the English ambassador was recalled from Paris and both countries prepared vigorously for war. The first result was that the English deemed it prudent to evacuate Philadelphia and retreat to New York. Washington endeavored to cut off their retreat, and a battle took place at Freehold Courthouse, in which the Americans were worsted. Washington drew off his army, and the British army continued its march to New York without further opposition. Early in May the French sent off a fleet of 12 ships of the line and 6 frigates, carrying a large number of troops commanded by Count d'Estaing. An English fleet under Admiral Byron was lying at Portsmouth, and this sailed on June 9th in pursuit, for it was not until that time that information was received of the intended destination of the French fleet. D'Estaing reached the American coast upon the very day on which the English army re-entered New York, and after making a demonstration before that town the French fleet sailed for Rhode Island to expel the British troops under Sir Robert Pigott, who held it. Lord Howe sailed with the fleet from New York to give battle to that of D'Estaing. For 2 days the fleets maneuvered in sight of each other. Howe, being inferior in force, wished to gain the weather gauge before fighting. Failing to do this, on the 3rd day he offered battle, but a tremendous storm prevented the engagement and dispersed both fleets. The French vessels retired to Boston and the English to New York. Taking advantage of the departure of the French fleet, Sir Robert attacked the American force, which had crossed to Rhode Island to act with the French, and drove them from it. While crossing the Atlantic, the fleet under Admiral Byron had met with a tremendous storm, which had entirely dispersed it, and the vessels arrived singly at New York. When their repairs were completed, the whole set out to give battle to the French, but D'Estaing, finding that by the junction of the 2 English fleets he was now menaced by a superior force, sailed away to the West Indies. After his departure an expedition was sent down along the coast to Georgia and East Florida. This met with great success. Savannah was captured, and the greater part of South Carolina was occupied. The majority of the inhabitants joyfully welcomed the troops, and many companies of volunteers were raised. Harold had arrived in New York early in the spring. He had been offered a commission, but he preferred remaining with his 2 comrades in the position of scout. In this way he had far greater independence, and while enjoying pay and rations sufficient for his maintenance, he was to a great extent master of his own movements. At an earlier period of the war he was offered by General Howe a commission in the army, and his father would have been glad had he accepted it. Harold, however, although determined to fight until the struggle between the colonists and the mother country came to an end one way or the other, had no great liking for the life of an officer in the regular army, but had resolved at the conclusion of the war to settle down upon a farm on the lakes, a life for which he felt far more fitted than for the strict discipline and regularity of that of an officer in the army. As, with the exception of the attack by the French fleet and American army upon Rhode Island, both parties remained quiet all through the summer of 1778, the year passed uneventfully to him, and the duties of the scouts were little more than nominal. During the winter fighting went on in the Carolinas and Georgia with varied success. In the spring of 1779 Harold and his comrades were, with a party of scouts, sent down to Georgia, where constant skirmishes were going on, and the services of a body of men accustomed to outpost duty were required. They were landed in May and joined General Prevost's force on the island of St. John, situated close to the mainland and connected with it by a bridge of boats, at the end of which on the mainland a post had been erected. Shortly afterwards General Prevost left for Savannah, taking with him most of the troops, which were carried away in the sloops which had formed the bridge of boats. On the American side, General Lincoln commanded a considerable army, which had been dispatched by Congress to drive the English from that state and the Carolinas. Lieutenant Colonel Maitland, who commanded the post on the mainland, was left with only a flatboat to keep up his communication with the island. He had under his command the 1st Battalion of the 71st Highlanders, now much weakened in numbers, part of a Hessian regiment, some provincial volunteers, and a detachment of artillery, the whole not exceeding 500 effective men. Hearing that General Lincoln was advancing against him, Colonel Maitland sent all his sick, baggage, and horses across to the island, and placed the post as far as possible in a defensive position. Most of the scouts who had come down from New York had accompanied General Prevost to Savannah, but Harold, with Peter Lambton, Jake, and 3 or 4 others, had been ordered to remain with Colonel Maitland, and were sent out to reconnoiter when the enemy were known to be approaching. "This is something like our old work, Peter, upon Lake Champlain," Harold said, as with his 2 comrades he took his way in the direction from which the enemy were advancing. "Aye, lad, but they've none of the redskins with 'em, and there'll be no great difficulty in finding out all about 'em. Besides, we've got Jake with us, and just about here Jake can do better nor we can. Niggers swarm all over the country, and are as ready to work for one side as the other, just as their masters go. All Jake has got to do is dress himself up as a plantation nigger and stroll into their camp. No question will be asked him, as he will naturally be taken for a slave on some neighboring estate. What do you say, Jake?" Jake at once assented, and when they approached the enemy he left his comrades and carried their plan into execution. He was away 6 hours, and returned saying that the enemy were 5,000 strong with 8 pieces of artillery. "We must hurry back," Peter said. "Them are big odds agin us. If all our troops were regulars, I don't say as they might not hold the place, but I don't put much count on the Germans, and the colonists ain't seen no fighting. However, Colonel Maitland seems a first-rate officer. He's been real sharp in putting the place into a state of defense, and I reckon if the Yankees thinks as they're going to eat us up without trouble, they'll be mistaken." Jake reported that the enemy were on the point of marching forward, and the scouts hurried back to give Colonel Maitland news of their coming. It was late in the afternoon when they reached the post. "At what time do you think they will arrive here?" the colonel asked, when Jake made his report. "Dey be pretty close by dark, for sure," Jake replied. "But I don't think, sir," Peter added, "they'll attack before morning. They wouldn't be likely to try it in the dark, not knowing the nature of the place." The commander was of the same opinion, but to prevent the possibility of surprise he placed pickets at some distance round the fort, the scouts being, of course, of the party. The night passed quietly, but at 7 in the morning Peter, Harold, and Jake, who were at some distance in advance of the others, saw the enemy approaching. They fired their pieces and fell back upon the outposts. Their position was rather to the right of the line of defense. The pickets were about to fall back when 70 men, being 2 companies of the 71st under Captain Campbell, were sent out to feel the enemy. "We're going to have a skirmish," Peter said. "I know these Highlanders. Instead of just firing a bit and then falling back, they'll be sticking here and fighting, as if they thought they could lick the whole army of the Yankees." It was as Peter predicted. The Highlanders took post behind a hedge and maintained a desperate resistance to the advance of the enemy. Harold and his comrades for some time fought with them. "It's time for us to be out of this," Peter said presently. "Let's just fall back to the fort." "We cannot fall back till they do, Peter." "I don't see that," Peter said. "We're scouts, and I don't see no advantage in our chunking away our lives because these hot-headed Highlanders choose to do so. Peter Lambton's ready to do a fair share of fighting, but when he's sure that fighting ain't no good, then he goes." And suiting the action to the word, Peter rose from his recumbent position and began to make his way back to camp, taking advantage of every bit of cover. Harold could not help laughing. For an instant he remained irresolute, and then, seeing the overwhelming forces with which the enemy were approaching, he called to Jake and followed Peter's example. So obstinately did the Highlanders fight that they did not retreat until all their officers were killed or wounded, and only 11 men out of the 2 companies succeeded in regaining the camp. The whole force of the enemy now advanced against the works, and halting at a distance of 300 yards, opened a tremendous fire from their cannon on the entrenchments. The defenders replied, but so overwhelming was the force of the assailants that the Hessians abandoned the portion of the works committed to them and fell back. The enemy pressed forward and had already gained the foot of the abattis when Colonel Maitland brought up a portion of the 71st upon the right, and these gallant troops drove the Americans back with slaughter. Colonel Maitland and his officers then threw themselves among the Hessians and succeeded in rallying them and bringing them back to the front. The provincial volunteers had also fought with great bravery. They had for a time been pressed backwards, but finally maintained their position. The Americans, finding that all their efforts to carry the post were unavailing, fell back to the forest. On the English side the loss amounted to 129. The Americans fought in the open and suffered much more heavily. The position of matters was suddenly changed by the arrival of Count d'Estaing with a fleet of 41 ships of war off the coast. The American general, Lincoln, at once proposed to him to undertake a combined movement to force the English to quit Georgia. The arrival of the French fleet was wholly unexpected, and the Experiment, a frigate of 50 guns commanded by Sir James Wallace, having 2 or 3 ships under his convoy, fell in with them off the mouth of the Savannah River. Although the Experiment had been much crippled by a gale through which she had recently passed, Sir James Wallace would not haul down his flag, and opposed a desperate resistance to the whole of the French fleet, and did not surrender until the Experiment was completely dismasted and riddled with shot. Upon the news that the French fleet was off the mouth of the river, Captain Henry, who commanded the little squadron of 4 small English ships, fell back to Savannah after removing all the buoys from the river. He landed his guns from the ships and mounted them on the batteries, and the marines and bluejackets were also put on shore to assist in the defense. 2 of the brigs of war were sunk across the channel below the town to prevent the French frigates coming up. A boom was laid across above the town to prevent fire rafts from being sent down. D'Estaing landed the French troops at the mouth of the river, and, marching to the town, summoned General Prevost to surrender. The English commander, who had sent off a messenger to Colonel Maitland, ordering him to march instantly to his assistance with the force under him, which now amounted to 800 men, asked for 24 hours before giving an answer. D'Estaing, who knew that General Lincoln was close at hand, made sure that Prevost would surrender without resistance, and so granted the time asked for. Before its expiration, Colonel Maitland, after a tremendous march, arrived at the town. As the French commanded the mouth of the river, he had been obliged to transport his troops in boats through the marshes by a little creek, which for 2 miles was so shallow that the troops were forced to wade waist deep, dragging the boats by main force through the mud. Upon the arrival of this reinforcement, General Prevost returned an answer to Count d'Estaing that the town would be defended to the last. Some time was spent by the enemy in landing and bringing up heavy artillery from the ships, and the French and Americans did not begin their works against the town until September 23rd. The garrison had utilized the time thus afforded to them to erect new defenses. The allied force of the assailants consisted of more than 10,000 Americans and 5,000 French troops, while the garrison, including regulars, provincial corps, sailors, militia, and volunteers, did not exceed 2,500. Nevertheless, they did not allow the enemy to carry on their work without interruption. Several sorties were made. The first of these, under Major Graham of the 16th Regiment, reached the lines of the enemy and threw them into confusion. Large reinforcements came up to their assistance, and as Graham's detachment fell back upon the town, the enemy incautiously pursued it so close up to the British lines that both artillery and musketry were brought to bear upon them, and they lost a large number of men before they could regain their works. On the morning of October 4th, the batteries of the besiegers opened fire with 53 pieces of heavy artillery and 14 mortars. General Prevost sent a request to Count d'Estaing that the women and children might be permitted to leave the town and embark on board vessels lying in the river, there to await the issue of the fight. But the French commander refused the request in a letter couched in insulting terms. The position of Savannah was naturally strong. The river protected one of its sides, and a deep swamp, partially flooded by it, covered another. The 2 other were open to the country, which in front of them was for several miles level and clear of wood. The works which had been thrown up on these sides were extremely strong. When the French first landed there were but 10 pieces of cannon upon the fortifications, but so incessantly did the garrison work that before the conclusion of the siege nearly 100 pieces of artillery were mounted on the redoubts and batteries erected round the town. Upon the side of the swamp there was not much fear of attack, but 3 redoubts were erected to prevent a surprise from this direction. The defense on the right face of the town was conducted by Colonel Maitland. The defense on the left, consisting of 2 strong redoubts and several batteries, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Kruger. In the center were several strong works, of which General Prevost himself took the special supervision. The whole British line, except where the swamp rendered no such defense necessary, was surrounded by a thick abattis. The French fire made no sensible impression upon the English defenses, but finding that the British artillery equalled his own, D'Estaing determined to discontinue the attack by regular approaches, and to carry the place by storm. His position was a perilous one. He had already spent a long time before the place, and at any moment the English fleet might arrive from the West Indies and attack his fleet, which was weakened by the men and guns which had been landed to carry on the siege. He therefore determined to risk an assault rather than remain longer before the town. To facilitate the attack, an officer with 5 men on October 8th advanced to the abattis and set fire to it. The wood, however, was still green, and the flames were easily extinguished. The attack was fixed for the following morning. Bodies of the American militia were to feign attacks upon the center and left, while a strong force of the combined armies was to make a real attack in 2 columns upon the right. The troops composing the 2 columns consisted of 3,500 French soldiers and 950 Americans. The principal force, commanded by Count D'Estaing in person, assisted by General Lincoln, was to attack the Springfield redoubt, which was situated at the extreme right of the British central line of defense and close to the edge of the swamp. The other column, under the command of Colonel Dillon, was to move silently along the margin of the swamp, past the 3 redoubts, and get into the rear of the British lines. The troops were in motion long before daylight. The attempt to burn the abattis had excited the suspicion of the English that an assault might be intended, and accordingly pickets were thrown out in front of the entrenchments, and the scouts were ordered to keep a sharp watch among the trees which grew in and near the swamp. Harold, with his friends, had accompanied Colonel Maitland's column in its march to Savannah, and had labored vigorously at the defenses, being especially occupied in felling trees and chopping wood for the abattis. Before daybreak they heard the noise made by the advance of the enemy's columns through the wood, and hurried back to the Springfield redoubt, where the garrison at once stood to arms. In this redoubt were a corps of provincial dismounted dragoons, supported by the South Carolina regiment. Just as daylight appeared, the column led by Count D'Estaing advanced toward the Springfield redoubt, but the darkness was still so intense that it was not discovered until within a very short distance of the works. Then a blaze of musketry opened upon it, while a destructive crossfire was poured in from the adjoining batteries. So heavy was the fire that the head of the column was almost swept away. The assailants kept on with great bravery until they reached the redoubt. Here a desperate hand-to-hand contest took place. Captain Tawsey fell with many of his men, and for a moment a French and an American standard were planted upon the parapet. Nevertheless, the defenders continued to cling to the place, and every foot was desperately contested. At this moment Colonel Maitland, with the grenadiers of the 60th Regiment and the Marines, advanced and fell upon the enemy's column, already shaken by the obstinate resistance it had encountered, and by its losses by the fire from the batteries. The movement was decisive. The assailants were driven headlong from the redoubt and retreated, leaving behind them 637 of the French troops killed and wounded, and 264 of the Americans. In the meantime the column commanded by Count Dillon mistook its way in the darkness and was entangled in the swamp, from which it was unable to extricate itself, until it was broad daylight, and it was fully exposed to the view of the garrison and to the fire from the British batteries. This was so hot and so well directed that the column was never able even to form, far less to penetrate, into the rear of the British lines. When the main attack was repulsed, Count Dillon drew off his column also. No pursuit was ordered as, although the besiegers had suffered greatly, they were still 3 times more numerous than the garrison. A few days afterward the French withdrew their artillery and re-embarked on board ship. The siege of Savannah cost the Allies 1,500 men, while the loss to the garrison was only 120. The pleasure of the garrison at their successful defense was marred by the death of Colonel Maitland, who died from the effects of an unhealthy climate and the exertions he had made. A few days after the raising of the siege, the French fleet was dispersed by a tempest, and Count D'Estaing, with the majority of the ships under his command, returned to France. During the course of this year there were many skirmishes round New York, but nothing of any great importance took place. Sir Henry Clinton, who was in supreme command, was unable to undertake any offensive operations on a large scale, for he had not received the reinforcements from home which he had expected. England, indeed, had her hands full, for in June Spain joined France and America in the coalition against her and declared war. Spain was at that time a formidable marine power, and it needed all the efforts that could be made by the English government to make head against the powerful fleets which the combined nations were able to send to sea against them. It was not only in Europe that the Spaniards were able to give effective aid to the Allies. They were still a power on the American continent, and created a diversion, invading West Florida and reducing and capturing the town and fort of Mobile. In the spring of 1870 Sir Henry Clinton sent down an expedition, under the command of Lord Cornwallis, to capture Charleston and reduce the state of South Carolina. This town was extremely strongly fortified. It could only be approached by land on one side, while the water, which elsewhere defended it, was covered by the fire of numerous batteries of artillery. The water of the bay was too shallow to admit of the large men of war passing, and the passage was defended by Fort Moultrie, a very formidable work. Admiral Arbuthnot, with the Renown, Romulus, Roebuck, Richmond, Blonde, Raleigh, and Virginia frigates, with a favorable wind and tide ran the gauntlet of Fort Moultrie, succeeded in passing up without great loss, and cooperated on the sea face with the attack of the army on the land side. A force was landed on Sullivan's Island, on which Fort Moultrie stood, and the fort, unprepared for an attack in this direction, was obliged to surrender. The American cavalry force, which had been collected for the relief of the town, was defeated by the English under General Tarleton. The trenches were pushed forward with great vigor, and the batteries of the third parallel opened at short range on the town with great execution. The advances were pushed forward at the ditch, when the garrison, seeing that further resistance was impossible, surrendered. 5,000 prisoners were taken, 1,000 American and French seamen, and 10 French and American ships of war. With the fall of Charleston, all resistance ceased in South Carolina. The vast majority of the inhabitants made their submission to the British government, and several loyalist regiments were raised. Colonel Tarleton, with 170 cavalry and 100 mounted infantry, was dispatched against an American force under Colonel Burford, consisting of 350 infantry, a detachment of cavalry, and 2 guns, which had taken post on the border of North Carolina. Tarleton came up with him, and after sharp action the Americans were entirely defeated. 113 were killed on the spot, and 207 made prisoners, of whom 103 were badly wounded. For some months the irregular operations were continued, the Americans making frequent incursions into the Carolinas. The British troops suffered greatly from the extreme heat and the unhealthiness of the climate. In August the American General Gates advanced toward Camden, and Lord Cornwallis also moved out to that town, which was held by a British garrison. The position there was not hopeful. Nearly 800 were sick, and the total number of effectives was under 2,000, of whom 500 were provincials. The force under General Gates amounted to 6,000 men, exclusive of the corps of Colonel Sumter, 1,000 strong, which were maneuvering to cut off the English retreat. Cornwallis could not fall back on Charleston without abandoning the sick and leaving all his magazines and stores in the hands of the enemy, besides which a retreat would have involved the abandonment of the whole state, with the exception of Charleston. He therefore decided upon giving battle to the enemy, who were posted at Rugeley's Mills, a few miles distant, leaving the defense of Camden to Major MacArthur, with some provincials and convalescent soldiers, and a detachment of the 63rd Regiment, which was expected to arrive during the night. The army marched in the following order. The 1st Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Webster, consisting of 4 companies of light infantry, and the 23rd and 33rd Regiments, preceded by an advance guard of 40 cavalry. The 2nd Division, consisting of provincial troops and 2 battalions of the 71st Regiment, followed as a reserve. The dragoons of the Legion formed the rear guard. The force marched at 10 o'clock on the night of August 16th, intending to attack at daybreak the next morning, but it happened that at the very same hour in which the British set out, General Gates with his force was starting from Rugeley's Mills with the intention of attacking Camden in the morning. At 2 o'clock in the night the advanced guards of the 2 armies met and fired into each other. In the confusion some prisoners were taken on both sides, and the generals, finding that the 2 armies were face to face, halted and waited till morning. Lord Cornwallis placed Webster's division on the right, the 2nd Division, which was under the command of Lord Rawdon, on the left. The battalion known as the Volunteers of Ireland were on the right of Lord Rawdon's division, and communicated with the 33rd Regiment on the left of Webster. In the front line were 2 6-pounders and 2 3-pounders under the command of Lieutenant McLeod, R.A. The 71st, with 2 6-pounders, was in reserve, 1 battalion being placed behind each wing. The dragoons were held in reserve, to charge in the event of a favorable opportunity. The flanks of the English position were covered by swamps, which somewhat narrowed the ground and prevented the Americans from utilizing fully their great superiority of numbers. The Americans were also formed in 2 lines. Soon after daybreak Lord Cornwallis ordered Colonel Webster to advance and charge the enemy. So fiercely did the English regiments attack that the Virginia and North Carolina troops who opposed them quickly gave way, threw down their arms, and fled. General Gates and General Caswell in vain attempt to rally them. They ran like a torrent and spread through the woods in every direction. Lord Rawdon began the action on the left with no less vigor and spirit than Lord Cornwallis on the right, but here and in the centre the contest was more obstinately maintained by the Americans. Their reserves were brought up and the artillery did considerable execution. Their left flank was, however, exposed by the flight of the troops of Carolina and Virginia, and the light infantry and 23rd Regiment were halted in the pursuit, and, wheeling around, came upon the flank of the enemy, who, after brave resistance of nearly 3/4 of an hour, were driven into total confusion and forced to give way on both sides. Their rout was continued by the cavalry, who continued their pursuit 22 miles from the field of action. Between 800 and 900 of the enemy were killed, and about 1,000, many of whom were wounded, were taken prisoners. Among these were Major General Baron de Kalb and Brigadier General Rutherford. All the baggage, stores, and camp packages, a number of colors, and several pieces of cannon were taken. General Gates, finding himself unable to rally the militia, fled first to Charlotte, 90 miles from the seat of action, and then to Hillsborough, 180 from Camden. General Gist, alone of all the American commanders, was able to keep together about 100 men, who, flying across the swamp on their right, through which they could not be pursued by the cavalry, made their escape in a body. The loss of the British troops amounted to 69 killed, 245 wounded, and 11 missing. The loss of the Americans in killed, wounded, and prisoners exceeded the number of British regular troops engaged by at least 300. It was one of the most decisive victories ever won. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. True to the Old Flag by G. A. Henty. Chapter 19. In an American Prison. Upon the morning after the victory of Camden, Lord Cornwallis dispatched Colonel Tarleton with the light infantry and the German legion, 350 men in all, to attack Colonel Sumter, who, with 800 men and 2 pieces of cannon, had, upon hearing late at night of General Gates's defeat, marched away at all speed. Thinking himself out of danger, he halted at midday to rest his men. The British came upon them by surprise. 150 were killed or wounded, and 300 made prisoners. The rest scattered as fugitives. 2 guns, 1,000 stand of arms, and all the stores and baggage were taken, and 250 prisoners, some of them British soldiers and the rest loyal militiamen, whom Sumter had captured near Camden, were released. Lord Cornwallis, after obtaining supplies for his troops and taking steps for the pacification of the state, was about to move forward into North Carolina when he received news of the destruction of a column under Major Ferguson. This officer, with a detachment of 150 British regulars and 800 provincials, was attacked by 5,000 mounted partisans, most of them border men accustomed to forest fighting. Ferguson took up a position on a hill called King's Mountain. This, from its height, would have been a good position for defense, but being covered with wood, it offered great opportunities for the assailants, who dismounted and fought behind trees in accordance with the tactics taught them in Indian warfare. Again and again the English charged with the bayonet, each time driving their assailants back, but these instantly recommenced their destructive fire from their shelter behind the trees. In little over an hour from the commencement of the fight, 150 of the defenders were killed and many more wounded. Still they repulsed every attack until their commander fell dead. Then the second in command, judging further resistance in vain, surrendered. On the news of this misfortune, Lord Cornwallis fell back, as the western frontiers of South Carolina were now exposed to the incursions of the band which had defeated Ferguson. In the retreat the army suffered terribly. It rained for several days without intermission. The soldiers had no tents, and the water was everywhere over their shoes. The continued rains filled the rivers and creeks prodigiously and rendered the roads almost impassable. The climate was most unhealthy, and for many days the troops were without rum. Sometimes the army had beef and no bread; sometimes bread and no beef. For 5 days it was supported on Indian corn, which was collected in the fields, 5 ears being served out as a daily allowance to each 2 soldiers. They had to cook it as they could, and this was generally done by parching it over the fire. One of the officers of the quartermaster's department found some of the loyal militia grating their corn. This was done by breaking up a canteen and punching holes in the bottom with their bayonets, thus making a kind of rasp. The idea was communicated to the adjutant general and afterward adopted for the army. The soldiers supported their hardships and privations cheerfully, as their officers were no better provided than themselves, and the fare of Lords Cornwallis and Rawdon was the same as their own. The toilsome march came to an end at last, and the army had rest after its labors. The only other incident of importance which occurred was an action between a force under Colonel Tarleton and one of considerably superior strength under General Sumter, strongly posted on a commanding position. The British attack was repulsed, but General Sumter, being badly wounded, was carried off the field during the night, and the force under his command at once dispersed. No other event occurred, and the army passed its time in winter quarters till the spring of 1781. During this winter the enemies of Great Britain were reinforced by the accession of the Dutch. At this time the efforts which England was called upon to make were indeed great. In Europe, France, Spain, and Holland were banded against her. In India our troops were waging a desperate war with Hyder Ali, while they were struggling to retain their hold on their American colonies. Here, indeed, the operations had for the last 2 years languished. The reinforcements which could be spared were extremely small, and although the British had almost uniformly defeated the Americans in every action in which there was any approach to equality between the forces engaged, they were unable to do more than hold the ground on which they stood. Victorious as they might be, the country beyond the reach of their rifles swarmed with their enemies, and it became increasingly clear to all impartial observers that it was impossible for an army which in all did not amount to more than 20,000 men to conquer a continent in arms against them. Harold was not present at the latter events of the campaign of 1780. He and Jake had been with the column of Major Fergusson. Peter Lambton had not accompanied them, having received a bullet wound in the leg in a previous skirmish, which, although not serious, had compelled him to lay up for a time. "Me no like de look ob dis affair, Massa Harold," Jake said, as the Americans opened fire upon the troops gathered at the top of King's Mountain. "Dese chaps no fools. Dey all backwoodsmen. Dey know how to fight de redskins. Great hunters all ob dem." "Yes," Harold agreed, "they are formidable opponents, Jake. I do not like the look of things. These men are all accustomed to fighting in the woods, while our men have no idea of it. Their rifles are infinitely superior to these army muskets, and every man of them can hit a deer behind the shoulder at a distance of 150 yards, while at that distance most of our men would miss a haystack." The scouts and a few of the provincials who had been accustomed to forest warfare took up their position behind trees and fought the advancing army in their own way. The mass of the defenders, however, were altogether puzzled by the stealthy approach of their foes, who advanced from tree to tree, seldom showing as much as a limb to the fire of the defenders, and keeping up a deadly fire upon the crowd of soldiers. Had there been time for Major Fergusson, before being attacked, to have felled a circle of trees and made a breastwork round the top of the hill, the result might have been different. Again and again the British gallantly charged down with the bayonet, but the assailants, as they did so, glided away among the trees after firing a shot or two into the advancing troops, and retreated 100 yards or so, only to recommence their advance as soon as the defenders retired again to their position. The loss of the assailants was very slight, the few who fell being for the most part killed by the rifles of the scouts. "It am no use, Massa Harold," Jake said. "Jest look how dem poor fellows am being shot down. It's all up wid us dis time." When upon the fall of Major Ferguson his successor in command surrendered the post, the defenders were disarmed. The Kentucky men, accustomed only to warfare against Indians, had no idea of the usages of war, and treated the prisoners with great brutality. 10 of the loyalist volunteers of Carolina they hung at once upon trees. There was some discussion as to the disposal of the rest. The border men, having accomplished their object, were anxious to disperse at once to their homes. Some of them proposed that they should rid themselves of all further trouble by shooting them all. This was overruled by the majority. Presently the prisoners were all bound, their hands being tied behind them, and 100 of the border men surrounded them and ordered them to march across the country. Jake and several other negroes who were among the captives were separated from the rest, and, being put up at auction, were sold as slaves. Jake fell to the bit of a tall Kentuckian who, without a word, fastened a rope round his neck, mounted his horse, and started for his home. The guards conducted the white prisoners to Woodville, 80 miles from the scene of the fight. This distance was accomplished in 2 days' march. Many of the unfortunate men, unable to support the fatigue, fell and were shot by their guards. The rest struggled on, utterly exhausted, until they arrived at Woodville, where they were handed over to a strong force of militia gathered there. They were now kindly treated, and by more easy marches were taken to Richmond, in Virginia, where they were shut up in prison. Here were many English troops, for the Americans, in spite of the terms of surrender, had still retained as prisoners the troops of General Burgoyne. Several weeks passed without incident. The prisoners were strongly guarded and were placed in a building originally built for a jail and surrounded by a very high wall. Harold often discussed with some of his fellow captives the possibility of escape. The windows were all strongly barred, and even should the prisoners break through these, they would only find themselves in the courtyard. There would then be a wall 30 feet high to surmount, and at the corners of this wall the Americans had built sentry boxes, in each of which 2 men were stationed night and day. Escape, therefore, seemed next to impossible. The sentries guarding the prison and at the gates were furnished by an American regiment stationed at Richmond. The wardens in the prison were, for the most part, negroes. The prisoners were confined at night in separate cells. In the daytime they were allowed, in parties of 50, to walk for 2 hours in the courtyard. There were several large rooms in which they sat and took their meals, 2 sentries with loaded muskets being stationed in each room. Thus, although monotonous, there was little to complain of. Their food, if coarse, was plentiful, and the prisoners passed the time in talk, playing cards, and in such games as their ingenuity could invent. One day, when 2 of the negro wardens entered with the dinners of the room to which Harold belonged, the latter was astounded at recognizing in one of them his faithful companion Jake. It was with difficulty that he suppressed an exclamation of gladness and surprise. Jake paid no attention to him, but placed the great tin dish heaped up with yams, which he was carrying, upon the table, and, with an unmoved face, left the room. A fortnight passed without a word being exchanged between them. Several times each day Harold saw the negro, but the guards were always present, and although, when he had his back to the latter, Jake sometimes indulged in a momentary grin or a pretentious wink, no further communication passed between them. One night at the end of that time, Harold, when on the point of going to sleep, thought he heard a noise as of his door gently opening. It was perfectly dark, and, after listening for a moment, he laid his head down again, thinking that he had been mistaken, when he heard close to the bed the words in a low voice, "Am you asleep, Massa Harold?" "No, Jake," he exclaimed directly. "Ah, my good fellow, how have you got here?" "Dat were a berry easy affair," Jake said. "Me tell you all about it." "Have you shut the door again, Jake? There is a sentry coming along the passage every 5 minutes." "Me shut him, massa, but dere ain't no fastening on dis side, so Jake will sit down wid him back against him." Harold got up and partly dressed himself and sat down again by the side of his follower. "No need to whisper," Jake said. "De walls and de doors berry thick. No one hear. But de sentries on de walls hear if we talk too loud." The windows were without glass, which was in those days an expensive article in America, and the mildness of the climate of Virginia rendered glass a luxury rather than a necessity. Confident that even the murmur of their voices would not be overheard if they spoke in their usual way, Jake and Harold were enabled to converse comfortably. "Well, massa," Jake said, "my story am not a long one. Dat man dat bought me he rode in 2 days someting like 100 miles. It were a lucky ting dat Jake had tramp on his feet de last 4 years, else soon enough he tumble down, and den de rope round him neck hang him. Jake awful footsore and tired when he git to de end of dat journey. De Kentucky man, he lib in a clearing not far from a village. He had 2 udder slaves. Dey hoe de ground and work for him. He got grown-up son, who look after dem while him fader away fighting. Dey not afraid of de niggers running away, because dere plenty redskin not far away, and nigger scalp jest as good as white man's. De udder way dere were plenty of villages, and dey tink nigger get caught for sure if he try to run away. Jake make up his mind he not stop dere berry long. The Kentuckian was a berry big, strong man, but not so strong as he was 10 years ago, and Jake tink he more dan a match for him. Jake pretty strong himself, massa?" "I should think you were, Jake," Harold said. "There are not many men, white or black, who can lift as great a weight as you can." For a week Jake work berry hard. Dat Kentuckian hab a way of always carrying his rifle about on his arm, and as long as he do dat, dere no chance ob a fair fight. De son he always hab a stick, and he mighty free wid it. He hit Jake several times, and me say to him once, 'Young man, you better mind what you do.' Me suppose dat he not like de look dat I give him. He speak to his fader, and he curse and swear awful, and stand wid de rifle close by, and tell dat son ob his to lare up Jake. Dat he do, massa, for some time. Jake not say notting, but he make note ob de affair in his mind. De berry next day de son go away to de village to buy some tings he want. De fader he come out and watch me at work. He curse and swear as usual. He call me lazy hound, and swear he cut de flesh from my back. Presently he come quite close and shake him fist in Jake's face. Dat was a foolish ting to do. So long as he keep both him hands on de gun, he could say what he like quite safe, but when he got one hand up level with Jake's nose, dat different ting altogether. Jake throw up his hand and close wid him. De gun tumble down and we wrestle and fight. He strong man for sure, but Jake just a little stronger. We roll ober and ober on the ground for some minutes. At last Jake get de upper hand and seize de white man by de throat, and he pretty quick choke him life out. Den he pick up de gun and wait for de son. When he come back he put a bullet through him. Den he go to de hut and get food and powder and ball and start into de woods. De other niggers dey take no part in de affair. Dey look on while the skirmish lasts, but not interfere one way or odder. When it ober, me ask them if dey like to go wid me, but dey too afraid of the redskins. So Jake start by himself. Me had plenty of practice in de woods and no fear of meeting redskins, except when dey on de warpath. De woods stretch a berry long way all ober de country, and Jake travel in dem for nigh 3 weeks. He shoot deer and manage berry well. See no redskin from the first day to de last. Den he come out into de open country again, hundreds of miles from de place where he kill dat Kentuckian. He leab his gun behind now and travel for Richmond, where he hear dat de white prisoners was kept. He walk all night and at day sleep in de woods or de plantations, and eat ears of corn. At last he get to Richmond. Den he give out dat him massa wanted him to fight on de side of de English, and dat he run away. He go to de prison and offer to work dere. Dey tink him story true, and as he had no massa to claim him, dey say he state property, and work without wages like de oder niggers here. Dey all forfeited slaves whose massas had joined de English. Dese people so poor dey can't afford to pay white man, so dey take Jake as warden, and by good luck dey put him in to carry de dinner to de berry room where Massa Harold was. And have you the keys to lock us up? No, massa, de niggers only cook de dinners and sweep de prison and de yard, and do dat kind of job. De white wardens, there's 6 ob dem, dey hab de keys. Then how did you manage to get here, Jake? Dat not very easy matter, Massa Harold. Most of de wardens drink like fish, but de head man, him dat keep de keys, he not drink. For some time Jake not see him way, but one night when he lock up de prisoners, he take Jake round wid him, and Jake carried de big bunch ob keys, 1 key to each passage. When he lock up de doors here and hand de key to Jake to put on de bunch again, Jake pull out a hair of him head and twist it round de word of de key, so as to know him again. Dat night me get a piece of bread and work him up wid some oil until he quite like putty, den me steal to de chief warden's room, and dere de keys hang up close to him bed. Jake got no shoes on, and he stole up very silent. He take down de bunch ob keys and carry dem off. He get to quiet place and strike a light, and search true de keys till he find de one wid de hair round it. Den he take a deep impression of him wid de bread. Den he carry back de keys and hang 'em up. Jake not allowed to leave de prison. We just as much prisoners as de white men, so he not able to go out and get a key made. But in de storeroom dere's all sorts ob tools, and he get hold ob a fine file. Den he look about among de keys in de doors ob all de storerooms and places which were not kept locked up. At last he find a key just de right size, and dough de wards were a little different, dey was ob de right shape. Jake set to work and filed off de knobs and pints which didn't agree wid de shape in de bread. Dis morning, when you was all out in de yard, me come up quietly and tried de key, and found that it turned de lock quite easy. Wid a fedder and some oil, me oiled de lock and de key till it turned without making de least noise. Den tonight me waited till de sentry came along de corridor, and den Jake slip along and here he is. Capital, Jake, Harold said. And now what is the next thing to do? Will it be possible to escape through the prison? No, Massa Harold, dere am 3 doors from de prison into de yard, and dere's a sentry outside of each, and de main guard ob 20 men are down dere too. No possible to get out ob doors without de alarm being given. With the file, Jake, we might cut through the bars. We might cut through de bars and get down into de courtyard. Dat easy enough, massa. Jake could get plenty ob rope from de storeroom, but we have de oder wall to climb. You must make a rope ladder for that, Jake. What sort ob a ladder dat, massa? Harold explained to him how it should be made. When you have finished it, Jake, you should twist strips of any sort of stuff, cotton or woolen, round and round each of the wooden steps, so that it will make no noise touching the wall as we climb it. Then we want a grapnel. Me no able to make dat, massa. Not a regular grapnel, Jake, but you might manage something which would do. What sort of ting? Jake asked. Harold sat for some time in thought. If the wall were not so high, it would be easy enough, Jake, for we could do it by fastening the rope within about 3 inches of the end of a pole 6 feet long and 3 inches thick. That would never pull over the wall, but it is too high to throw the pole over. Jake could throw such a stick as dat ober easy enough, massa. No difficulty bout dat. But me no see how a stick like dat balance massa's weight. It would not balance it, Jake, but the pull would be a side pull, and would not bring the stick over the wall. If it were only bamboo it would be heavy enough. Very well, Massa Harold, if you say so, dat's all right. Jake can get de wood easy enough. Dere's plenty of pieces among de firewood dat would do for us." "Roll it with strips of stuff the same way as the ladder steps, so as to prevent it making a noise when it strikes the wall. In addition to the ladder, we shall want a length of rope long enough to go from this window to the ground, and another length of thin rope more than twice the height of the wall." "Bery well, Massa Harold, me understand exactly what am wanted, but it will take 2 or 3 days to make de ladder, and me can only work ob a night." "There is no hurry, Jake. Do not run any risk of being caught. We must choose a dark and windy night. Bring 2 files with you, so that we can work together, and some oil." "All right, massa. Now me go." "Shut the door quietly, Jake, and do not forget to lock it behind you," Harold said, as Jake stole noiselessly from the cell. A week passed without Jake's again visiting Harold's cell. On the 7th night the wind had got up and whistled round the jail, and Harold, expecting that Jake would take advantage of the opportunity, sat down on his bed without undressing, and awaited his coming. It was but half an hour after the door had been locked for the night that it quietly opened again. "Here me am, sar, wid eberyting dat's wanted. 2 files and some oil, de rope ladder, de short rope for us to slide down, and de long thin rope and de piece of wood 6 feet long and thick as de wrist." They at once set to work with the files, and in an hour had sawn through 2 bars, making a hole sufficiently wide for them to pass. The rope was then fastened to a bar. Harold took off his shoes and put them in his pocket, and then slid down the rope into the courtyard. With the other rope Jake lowered the ladder and pole to him, and then slid down himself. Harold had already tied to the pole, at 4 inches from one end, a piece of rope some 4 feet long, so as to form a loop about half that length. The thin rope was put through the loop and drawn until the 2 ends came together. Noiselessly they stole across the yard until they reached the opposite wall. The night was a very dark one, and although they could make out the outline of the wall above them against the skyline, the sentry boxes at the corners were invisible. Harold now took hold of the 2 ends of the rope, and Jake, stepping back a few yards from the wall, threw the pole over it. Then Harold drew upon the rope until there was a check, and he knew that the pole was hard up against the edge of the wall. He tied one end of the rope ladder to an end of the double cord, and then hauled steadily upon the other. The rope running through the loop drew the ladder to the top of the wall. All this was done quickly and without noise. "Now, Jake, do you go first," Harold said. "I will hold the rope tight below, and do you put part of your weight on it as you go up. When you get to the top, knot it to the loop and sit on the wall until I come up." In 3 minutes they were both on the wall, the ladder was hauled up and dropped on the outside, while the pole was shifted to the inside of the wall. Then they descended the ladder and made across the country. "Which way we go, massa?" Jake asked. "I have been thinking it over," Harold replied, "and have decided upon making for the James River. We shall be there before morning, and can no doubt find a boat. We can guide ourselves by the stars, and when we get into the woods the direction of the wind will be sufficient." The distance was about 20 miles, but although accustomed to scouting at night, they would have had difficulty in making their way through the woods by morning had they not struck upon a road leading in the direction in which they wanted to go. Thus it was still some hours before daylight when they reached the James River. They had followed the road all the way, and at the point where it reached the bank there was a village of considerable size, and several fishermen's boats were moored alongside. Stepping into one of these, they unloosened the head rope and pushed out into the stream. The boat was provided with a sail. The mast was soon stepped and the sail hoisted. Neither Harold nor Jake had had much experience in boat sailing, but the wind was with them, and the boat ran rapidly down the river, and before daylight they were many miles from their point of starting. The banks of the James River were low and swampy, and few signs of human habitation were seen from the stream. It widened rapidly as they descended and became rougher and rougher. They therefore steered into a sheltered spot behind a sharp bend of the river and anchored. In the locker they found plenty of lines and bait, and, setting to work, had soon half a dozen fine fish at the bottom of the boat. They pulled up the kedge, and rowed to shore and soon made a fire, finding flint and steel in the boat. The fish were broiled over the fire upon sticks. The boat was hauled in under some overhanging bushes, and, stretching themselves in the bottom, Harold and Jake were soon fast asleep. The sun was setting when they woke. "What you going to do, sar?" Jake asked. "Are you tinking of traveling by land or of sailing to New York?" "Neither, Jake," Harold answered. "I am thinking of sailing down the coast inside the line of keys to Charleston. The water there is comparatively smooth, and as we shall be taken for fishermen it is not likely that we shall be overhauled. We can land occasionally and pick a few ears of corn to eat with our fish, and as there is generally a breeze night and morning, however still and hot the day, we shall be able to do it comfortably. I see that there is an iron plate here which has been used for making a fire and cooking on board, so we will lay in a stock of dry wood before we start." The journey was made without any adventure. While the breeze lasted they sailed. When it fell calm they fished, and when they had obtained a sufficient supply for their wants, they lay down and slept under the shade of their sail stretched as an awning. Frequently they passed within hail of other fishing boats, generally manned by negroes. But beyond a few words as to their success, no questions were asked. They generally kept near the shore, and when they saw any larger craft they either hauled the boat up or ran into one of the creeks in which the coast abounds. It was with intense pleasure that at last they saw in the distance the masts of the shipping in Charleston harbor. 2 hours later they landed. They fastened the boat to the wharf and made their way into the town unquestioned. As they were walking along the principal street they saw a well-known figure sauntering leisurely toward them. His head was bent down and he did not notice them until Harold hailed him with a shout of, "Hello, Peter, old fellow, how goes it?" Peter, although not easily moved or excited, gave a yell of delight which astonished the passers-by. "Ah, my boy!" he exclaimed. "This is a good sight for my old eyes. Here have I been a-fretting and a-worrying myself for the last 3 months, and cussing my hard luck that I was not with you in that affair on King's Mountain. At first when I heard of it, I says to myself, the young'un got out of it somehow. He ain't going to be caught asleep. Well, I kept on hoping and hoping you'd turn up, till at last I couldn't deceive myself no longer, and was forced to conclude that you'd either been rubbed out or taken prisoner. About a month ago we got from the Yankees a list of the names of them they'd captured, and glad I was to see yours among 'em. As I thought as how you weren't likely to be out as long as the war lasted, I was a-thinking of giving it up and going to Montreal and settling down there. It was lonesome like without you, and I missed Jake's laugh, and altogether things didn't seem natural like. Jake, I'm glad to see ye. Your name was not on the list, but I thought it likely enough they might have taken you and set you to work, and made no account of ye." "That is just what they did, but he got away after settling his score with his new master, and then made for Richmond, where I was in prison. Then he got me loose, and here we are. But it is a long story, and I must tell it you at leisure." End of chapter 19. Recording by TriciaG. Chapter 20 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. True to the Old Flag by G.A. Henty. Chapter 20. The War in South Carolina. The fishing boat was disposed of for a few pounds, and Harold and Jake were again fitted out in the semi-uniform worn by the scouts. On December 13, the very day after their arrival, a considerable detachment of troops under General Leslie arrived, and on the 19th marched, 1,500 strong, to join Lord Cornwallis. Harold and his mates accompanied them, and the united army proceeded northwest between the Roanoke and Catawba rivers. Colonel Tarleton was detached with a force of 1,000 men, consisting of light and German Legion infantry, a portion of the 7th Regiment and of the 1st Battalion of the 71st, 350 cavalry, and 2 field pieces. His orders were to pursue and destroy a force of some 800 of the enemy under General Morgan. The latter, finding himself pressed, drew up his troops for action near a place called the Cowpens. Then ensued the one action in the whole war in which the English, being superior in numbers, suffered a severe defeat. Tarleton, confident of victory, led his troops to the attack without making any proper preparations for it. The infantry advanced bravely, and, although the American infantry held the ground for a time with great obstinacy, they drove them back and the victory appeared to be theirs. Tarleton now sent orders to his cavalry to pursue, and his infantry were too exhausted, having marched at a rapid pace all night, to do so. The order was not obeyed, and Major Washington, who commanded the American cavalry, advanced to cover his infantry. These rallied behind their shelter and fell upon the disordered British infantry. Thus suddenly attacked when they believed that victory was in their hands, the English gave way and were driven back. A panic seized them, and a general rout ensued. Almost the whole of them were either killed or taken prisoners. Tarleton in vain endeavored to induce his German Legion cavalry to charge. They stood aloof, and at last fled in a body through the woods. Their commander and 14 officers remained with Tarleton, and with those and 40 men of the 17th Regiment of Dragoons he charged the whole body of the American cavalry and drove them back upon the infantry. No partial advantage, however brilliant, could retrieve the misfortune of the day. All was already lost, and Tarleton retreated with his gallant little band to the main army under Lord Cornwallis, 25 miles from the scene of action. The British infantry were all killed, wounded, or taken prisoners, with the exception of a small detachment which had been left in the rear, and who fell back hastily as soon as the news of the result of the action reached them. The Legion cavalry returned to camp without the loss of a man. The defeat at Cowpens had a serious influence on the campaign. It deprived Lord Cornwallis of the greater portion of his light infantry, who were of the greatest utility in a campaign in such a country, while the news of the action had an immense influence in raising the spirits of the colonists. Hitherto they had uniformly met with ill success when they opposed the British with forces even approaching an equality of strength. In spite of their superior arms and superior shooting, they were unable to stand the charge of the British infantry, who had come almost to despise them as foes in the field. The unexpected success urged them to fresh exertions, and brought to their side vast numbers of waverers. General Morgan, who was joined by General Greene, attempted to prevent Cornwallis passing the fords of the Catawba. It was not till February 1 that the river had fallen sufficiently to render a passage possible. Colonel Webster was sent with his division to one of the principal fords, with orders to open a cannonade there and make a feint of crossing, while the general himself moved toward a smaller and less known ford. General Davidson, with 300 Americans, was watching this point, but the brigade of guards were ordered to commence the passage, and were led by their light infantry companies under Colonel Hall. The river was 500 yards across, and the stream so strong that the men, marching in fours, had to support one another to enable them to withstand its force. The ford took a sharp turn in the middle of the river. The night being dark, the guards were not perceived until they had reached this point, when the enemy immediately opened fire upon them. The guide at once fled, without his absence being noticed until it was too late to stop him. Colonel Hall, not knowing of the bend in the ford, led his men straight forward toward the opposite bank, and although their difficulties were much increased by the greater depth of water through which they had to pass, the mistake was really the means of saving them from much loss, as the Americans were assembled to meet them at the head of the ford, and would have inflicted a heavy loss upon them as they struggled in the stream. They did not perceive the change in the direction of the column's march until too late, and the guards, on landing, met them as they came on and quickly routed and dispersed them. The British lost 4 killed, among whom was Colonel Hall, and 36 wounded. The rest of the division then crossed. Colonel Tarleton, with his cavalry, was sent against 500 of the Americans who had fallen back from the various fords, and, burning with the desire to retrieve the defeat of the Cowpens, the Legion horse charged the enemy with such fury that they were completely routed, 50 of them being killed. Morgan and Greene withdrew their army through the Roanoke River, hotly pursued by the English. For a few days the British army remained at Hillsborough, but no supplies of food sufficient for its maintenance could be found there, so it again fell back. General Greene, being reinforced by a considerable force, now determined to fight, and accordingly advanced and took up a position near Guilford Court House. Battle of Guilford, fought on the 15th of March, 1781. The American force consisted of 4,243 infantry and some 3,000 irregulars, for the most part backwoodsmen from the frontier, while the British force amounted to 1,445, exclusive of their cavalry, who, however, took little part in the fight. About 4 miles from Guilford the advanced guards of the army met and a sharp fight ensued, the Americans, under Colonel Lee, maintaining their ground staunchly until the 23rd Regiment came up to the assistance of Tarleton, who commanded the advance. The main American force was posted on an exceedingly strong position. Their first line was on commanding ground, with open fields in front. On their flanks were woods, and a strong fence ran along in front of their line. The second line was posted in a wood 300 yards in rear of the first, while 400 yards behind were 3 brigades drawn up in the open ground round Guilford Court House. Colonel Washington, with 2 regiments of dragoons and 1 of riflemen, formed a reserve for the right flank. Colonel Lee, with his command, was in reserve on the left. As soon as the head of the British column appeared in sight, 2 guns upon the road opened fire upon them, and were answered by the English artillery. While the cannonade continued, the British formed in order of attack. The 71st, with a provincial regiment, supported by the 1st Battalion of the Guards, formed the right. The 23rd and 33rd, led by Colonel Webster, with the Grenadiers and 2nd Battalion of Guards, formed the left. The light infantry of the Guards and the cavalry were in reserve. When the order was given to advance, the line moved forward in perfect steadiness, and at 150 yards the enemy opened fire. The English did not fire a shot till within 80 yards, when they poured in a volley and charged with the bayonet. The first line of the enemy at once fell back upon the second. Here a stout resistance was made. Posted in the woods and sheltering themselves behind trees, they kept up for some time a galling fire which did considerable execution. General Leslie brought up the right wing of the 1st Battalion of Guards into the front line, and Colonel Webster called up the 2nd Battalion. The enemy's second line now fell back on their third, which was composed of their best troops, and the struggle was a very obstinate one. The Americans, from their vastly superior numbers, occupied so long a line of ground that the English commanders, in order to face them, were obliged to leave large gaps between the different regiments. Thus it happened that Webster, who with the 33rd Regiment, the light infantry, and the 2nd Battalion of Guards turned toward the left, found himself separated from the rest of the troops by the enemy, who pushed in between him and the 23rd. These again were separated from the Guards. The ground was very hilly, the wood exceedingly thick, and the English line became broken up into regiments separated from each other, each fighting on its own account and ignorant of what was going on in other parts of the field. The 2nd Battalion of Guards was the first that broke through the wood into the open grounds of Guilford Court House. They immediately attacked a considerable force drawn up there, routed them, and took their 2 cannon with them; but, pursuing them with too much ardor and impetuosity toward the woods in the rear, were thrown into confusion by a heavy fire from another body of troops placed there, and being instantly charged by Washington's dragoons, were driven back with a great slaughter, and the cannon were retaken. At this moment the British guns, advancing along the road through the wood, issued into the open and checked the pursuit of the Americans by a well-directed fire. The 71st and the 23rd now came through the wood. The 2nd Battalion of Guards rallied and again advanced, and the enemy were quickly repulsed and put to flight. The 2 guns were recaptured, with 2 others. Colonel Webster, with the 33rd, returned across the ravine through which he had driven the enemy opposed to him, and rejoined the rest of the force. The Americans drew off in good order. The 23rd and 21st pursued with the cavalry for a short distance, and were then recalled. The fight was now over on the center and left, but on the right heavy firing was still going on. Here General Leslie, with the 1st Battalion of Guards and a Hessian regiment, had been greatly impeded by the excessive thickness of the woods, which rendered it impossible to charge with the bayonet. As they struggled through the thicket, the enemy swarmed around them, so that they were at times engaged in front, flanks, and rear. The enemy were upon an exceedingly steep rise, and lying along the top of this, they poured such a heavy fire into the guards that these suffered exceedingly. Nevertheless, they struggled up to the top and drove the front line back, but found another far more numerous drawn up behind. As the guards struggled up to the crest, they were received by a tremendous fire on their front and flanks, and suffered so heavily that they fell into confusion. The Hessian regiment, which had suffered but slightly, advanced in compact order to the left of the guards, and, wheeling to the right, took the enemy in the flank with a very heavy fire. Under cover of this, the guards reformed and moved forward to join the Hessians and complete the repulse of the enemy opposed to them. They were again attacked both in the flank and the rear, but at last they completely dispersed the troops surrounding them, and the battle came to an end. This battle was one of the most obstinate and well contested throughout the war, and the greatest credit is due to the British, who drove the enemy, 3 times their own number, from the ground chosen by them and admirably adapted to their mode of warfare. The loss, as might have been expected, was heavy, amounting to 93 killed and 413 wounded, nearly a third of the force engaged. Between 200 and 300 of the enemy's dead were found in the field of battle, and a great portion of their army was disbanded. The sufferings of the wounded on the following night were great. A tremendous rain fell, and the battle had extended over so large an area that it was impossible to find and collect them. The troops had had no food during the day, and had marched several miles before they came into action. Nearly 50 of the wounded died during the night. Decisive as the victory was, its consequences were slight. Lord Cornwallis was crippled by his heavy loss, following that which the force had suffered at the Cowpens. The 2 battles had diminished the strength of his little force by fully half. Provisions were difficult to obtain, and the inhabitants, some of whom had suffered greatly upon previous occasions for their loyal opinions, seeing the weakness of the force and the improbability of its being enabled to maintain itself, were afraid to lend assistance or to show their sympathy, as they would be exposed on its retreat to the most cruel persecutions by the enemy. 3 days after the battle, Lord Cornwallis retired, leaving 70 of the wounded, who were unable to move, under the protection of a flag of truce. From Guilford Court House he moved his troops to Wilmington, in North Carolina, a seaport where he hoped to obtain provisions and stores, especially clothing and shoes. General Greene, left unmolested after his defeat, reassembled his army, and receiving reinforcements, marched at full speed to attack Lord Rawdon at Camden, thinking that he would, with his greatly superior force, be able to destroy him in his isolated situation. The English commander fortified his position, and the American general drew back and encamped at Hobkirk Hill, 2 miles distant, to await the coming of his heavy baggage and cannon, together with some reinforcements. Lord Rawdon determined to take the initiative, and marching out with his whole force of 900 men, advanced to the attack. The hill was covered at its foot by a deep swamp, but the English marched round this and stormed the position. The Americans made an obstinate resistance, but the English climbed the hill with such impetuosity, in spite of the musketry and grape shot of the enemy, that they were forced to give way. Several times they returned to the attack, but were finally driven off in confusion. 100 prisoners were taken, and Lord Rawdon estimated that 400 of the enemy were killed and wounded. The American estimate was considerably lower, and as the Americans fought with all the advantage of position, while the English were exposed during their ascent to a terrible fire, which they were unable to return effectively, it is probable that the American loss, including the wounded, was inferior to that of the English, whose casualties amounted to 258. Harold and his companions did not take part either in the Battle of Guilford Court House or in that of Hobkirk Hill, having been attached to the fort known as 96, because a milestone with these figures upon it stood in the village. The force here was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Cruger, who had with him 150 men of a provincial corps known as Delancey's, 200 of the 2nd Battalion of the New Jersey Volunteers, and 200 local loyalists. The post was far advanced, but so long as Lord Rawdon remained at Camden, its position was not considered to be dangerous. The English general, however, after winning the Battle of Hobkirk Hill, received news of the retirement of Lord Cornwallis toward Wilmington, and seeing that he would thereby be exposed to the whole of the American forces in South Carolina and would infallibly be cut off from Charleston, he determined to retire upon that port. Before calling back, he sent several messengers to Colonel Cruger, acquainting him of his intention. But so well were the roads guarded by the enemy that none of the messengers reached 96. Colonel Cruger, being uneasy at the length of time which had elapsed since he had received any communication, sent Harold and the 2 scouts out with instructions to make their way toward the enemy's lines, and, if possible, to bring in a prisoner. This they had not much difficulty in doing. Finding out the position of 2 parties of the Americans, they placed themselves on the road between them. No long time elapsed before an American officer came along. A shot from Peter's rifle killed his horse, and before the officer could recover his feet, he was seized by the scouts. They remained hidden in the wood during the day, and at night returned with their prisoner to 96, 36 miles distant, avoiding all villages where resistance could be offered by hostile inhabitants. From the prisoner, Colonel Cruger learned that Lord Rawdon had retreated from Camden, and that he was therefore entirely isolated. The position was desperate, but he determined to defend the post to the last, confident that Lord Rawdon would, as soon as possible, undertake an expedition for his release. The whole garrison was at once set to work, stockades were erected, earthworks thrown up, a redoubt, formed of casks filled with earth, constructed, and the whole strengthened by ditches and abattis. Blockhouses were erected in the village to enable the troops to fire over the stockades, and covered communications made between various works. The right of the village was defended by a regular work called the Star. To the left was a work commanding a rivulet from which the place drew its supply of water. Colonel Cruger offered the volunteers, who were a mounted corps, permission to return to Charleston, but they refused to accept the offer, and, turning their horses into the woods, determined to share the fate of the garrison. In making this offer, the colonel was influenced partly by motives of policy, as the stock of provisions was exceedingly scanty, and he feared that they would not last if the siege should be a long one. Besides this, He feared that, as had already too often happened, should the place fall, even the solemn engagement of the terms of the surrender would not be sufficient to protect the loyalists against the vengeance of their countrymen. On May 21, General Greene, with his army, appeared in sight of the place and encamped in a wood within cannon shot of the village. He lost no time, and in the course of the night threw up 2 works within 70 paces of the fortifications. The English commander did not suffer so rash and disdainful a step to pass unpunished. The scouts, who were outside the works, brought in news of what was being done, and also that the working parties were protected by a strong force. The 3 guns which constituted the entire artillery of the defenders were moved noiselessly to the salient angle of the Star opposite the works, and at 11 o'clock in the morning these suddenly opened fire, aided by musketry from the parapets. The covering force precipitately retreated, and 30 men sallied out from the fort, carried the entrenchments, and bayoneted their defenders. Other troops followed, the works were destroyed, and the entrenching tools carried into the fort. General Greene, advancing with his whole army, arrived only in time to see the last of the sallying party re-enter the village. "I call that a right down good beginning," Peter Lambton said, in great exultation. "There's nothing like hitting a hard blow at the beginning of a fight. It raises your spirits and makes t'other chap mighty cautious. You'll see next time they'll begin their works at a much more respectful distance." Peter was right. The blow checked the impetuosity of the American general, and on the night of the 23rd he opened his trenches at a distance of 400 yards. Having so large a force, he was able to push forward with great rapidity, although the garrison made several gallant sorties to interfere with the work. On June 3rd the second parallel was completed. A formal summons was sent to the British commander to surrender. This document was couched in the most insolent language, and contained the most unsoldier-like threats of the consequences which would befall the garrison and its commander if he offered further resistance. Colonel Cruger sent back a verbal answer that he was not frightened by General Greene's menaces, and that he should defend the post until the last. The American batteries now opened with a heavy crossfire, which enfiladed several of the works. They also pushed forward a sap against the Star Fort and erected a battery, composed of gabions, 36 yards only from the abattis and raised 40 feet high, so as to overlook the works of the garrison. The riflemen posted on its top did considerable execution and prevented the British guns being worked during the day. The garrison tried to burn the battery by firing heated shot into it, but from want of proper furnaces they were unable to heat the shot sufficiently, and the attempt failed. They then protected their parapets as well as they could by sandbags with loopholes, through which the defenders did considerable execution with their rifles. Harold and his 2 comrades, whose skill with their weapons was notorious, had their post behind some sandbags immediately facing the battery, and were able completely to silence the fire of its riflemen, as it was certain death to show a head above its parapet. The enemy attempted to set fire to the houses of the village by shooting blazing arrows into them, a heavy musketry and artillery fire being kept up to prevent the defenders from quenching the flames. These succeeded, however, in preventing any serious conflagration, but Colonel Cruger ordered at once that the whole of the houses should be unroofed. Thus the garrison were for the rest of the siege without protection from the rain and night air, but all risk of a fire, which might have caused the consumption of their stores, was avoided. While the siege had been going on, the town of Augusta had fallen, and Lieutenant Colonel Lee, marching thence to reinforce General Greene, brought with him the British prisoners taken there. With a scandalous want of honorable feeling, he marched these prisoners along in full sight of the garrison, with all the parade of martial music, and preceded by a British standard reversed. If the intention was to discourage the garrison, it failed entirely in its effect. Fired with indignation at so shameful a sight, they determined to encounter every danger and endure every hardship, rather than fall into the hands of an enemy capable of disgracing their success by so wanton an insult to their prisoners. The Americans, strengthened by the junction of the troops who had reduced Augusta, began to make approaches against the stockaded fort on the left of the village, which kept open the communication of the garrison with their water supply. The operations on this side were entrusted to Colonel Lee, while General Greene continued to direct those against the Star. On the night of June 9 a sortie was made by two strong parties of the defenders. That to the right entered the enemy's trenches and penetrated to a battery of 4 guns, which nothing but the want of spikes and hammers prevented them from destroying. Here they discovered the mouth of a mine intended to be carried under one of the defenses of the Star. The division on the left fell in with the covering party of the Americans, killed a number of them, and made their commanding officer a prisoner. On the 12th, Colonel Lee determined to attempt a storm of the stockade on the left, and sent forward a sergeant and 6 men, with lighted combustibles, to set fire to the abattis. The whole of them were killed before effecting their purpose. A number of additional cannon now arrived from Augusta, and so heavy and incessant a fire was opened upon the stockade from 3 batteries that on the 17th it was no longer tenable, and the garrison evacuated it in the night. The suffering of the garrison for want of water now became extreme. With great labor a well had been dug in the fort, but no water was found, and none could be procured except from the rivulet within pistol shot of the enemy. In the day nothing could be done, but at night negroes, whose bodies in the darkness were not easily distinguished from the tree stumps which surrounded them, went out and at great risk brought in a scanty supply. The position of the garrison became desperate. Colonel Cruger, however, was not discouraged, and did his best to sustain the spirits of his troops by assurances that Lord Rawdon was certain to attempt to relieve the place as soon as he possibly could do so. At length, one day, to the delight of the garrison, an American royalist rode right through the pickets under the fire of the enemy, and delivered a verbal message from Lord Rawdon to the effect that he had passed Orangeburg and was on his march to raise the siege. Lord Rawdon had been forced to remain at Charleston until the arrival of 3 fresh regiments from Ireland enabled him to leave that place in safety and march to the relief of 96. His force amounted to 1,800 infantry and 150 cavalry. General Greene had also received news of Lord Rawdon's movements, and, finding from his progress that it would be impossible to reduce the fort by regular approaches before his arrival, he determined to hazard an assault. The American works had been pushed up close to the forts, and the 3rd parallel had been completed, and a mine and 2 trenches extended within a few feet of the ditch. On the morning of June 18, a heavy cannonade was begun from all the American batteries. The whole of the batteries and trenches were lined with riflemen, whose fire prevented the British from showing their heads above the parapets. At noon, 2 parties of the enemy advanced under cover of their trenches and made a lodgment in the ditch. These were followed by other parties with hooks to drag down the sandbags and tools to overthrow the parapet. They were exposed to the fire of the blockhouses in the village, and Major Greene, the English officer who commanded the Star Fort, had his detachment in readiness behind the parapet to receive the enemy when they attempted to storm. As the main body of the Americans did not advance beyond the 3rd parallel and contented themselves with supporting the parties in the ditch with their fire, the commander of the fort resolved to inflict a heavy blow. 2 parties, each 30 strong, under the command of Captains Campbell and French, issued from the sally port in the rear, entered the ditch, and, taking opposite directions, charged the Americans who had made the lodgment with such impetuosity that they drove everything before them until they met. The bayonet alone was used and the carnage was great. 2/3 of those who entered the trenches were either killed or wounded. General Greene, finding it useless any longer to continue the attempt, called off his troops, and on the following day raised the siege and marched away with all speed, having lost at least 300 men in the siege. Of the garrison, 27 were killed and 58 wounded. On the 21st, Lord Rawdon arrived at 96, and, finding that it would be hopeless for him to attempt to overtake the retreating enemy, who were marching with great speed, he drew off the garrison of 96 and fell back toward the coast. A short time afterward a sharp fight ensued between a force under Colonel Stewart and the army of General Greene. The English were taken by surprise and were at first driven back, but they recovered from their confusion and renewed the fight with great spirit, and after a desperate conflict the Americans were repulsed. 2 cannon and 60 prisoners were taken, among the latter Colonel Washington, who commanded the reserve. The loss on both sides was about equal, as 250 of the British troops were taken prisoners at the first outset. The Americans killed considerably exceeded our own. Both parties claimed the victory, the Americans because they had forced the British to retreat, the British because they had ultimately driven the Americans from the field and obliged them to retire to a strong position 7 miles in the rear. This was the last action of the war in South Carolina. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of True to the Old Flag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abigail Bartels. True to the Old Flag by G.A. Henty. Chapter 21. The End of the Struggle. Being unable to obtain any supplies at Wilmington, Lord Cornwallis determined to march on into Virginia and to effect a junction with the British force under General Arnold operating there. Arnold advanced to Pittsburgh, and Cornwallis effected a junction with him on May 20th. The Marquis de Lafayette, who commanded the colonial forces here, fell back. Just at this time, the Count de Grasse, with a large French fleet, arrived off the coast, and after some consultation with General Washington, determined that the French fleet and the whole American army should operate together to crush the forces under Lord Cornwallis. The English were hoodwinked by reports that the French fleet was intended to operate against New York, and it was not until they learned that the Count de Grasse had arrived with 28 ships of the line at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay that the true object of the expedition was seen. A portion of the English fleet encountered them, but after irregular actions, lasting over 5 days, the English drew off and retired to New York. The commander-in-chief then attempted to effect a diversion, in order to draw off some of the enemy who were surrounding Cornwallis. The fort of New London was stormed after some desperate fighting, and great quantities of ammunition and stores, and 50 pieces of cannon were taken. George Washington did not allow his attention to be distracted. Matters were in a most critical condition, for although to the English the prospect of ultimate success appeared slight indeed, the Americans were in a desperate condition. Their immense and long-continued efforts had been unattended with any material success. It was true that the British troops held no more ground now than they did at the end of the first year of the war, but no efforts of the colonists had succeeded in wresting that ground from them. The people were exhausted and utterly disheartened. Business of all sorts was at a standstill. Money had ceased to circulate, and the credit of Congress stood so low that its bonds had ceased to have any value whatever. The soldiers were unpaid, ill-fed, and mutinous. If on the English side it seemed that the task of conquering was beyond them, the Americans were ready to abandon the defense from sheer exhaustion. It was then of paramount necessity to General Washington that a great and striking success should be obtained to animate the spirits of the people. Cornwallis, seeing the formidable combination which the French and Americans were making to crush him, sent message after message to New York to ask for aid from the commander-in-chief, and received assurances from him that he would at once sail with 4,000 troops to join him. Accordingly, in obedience to his orders, Lord Cornwallis fortified himself at Yorktown. On September 28th, the combined army of French and Americans, consisting of 7,000 of the former and 12,000 of the latter, appeared before Yorktown and the post at Gloucester. Lord Cornwallis had 5,960 men, but so great had been the effects of the deadly climate in the autumn months that only 4,017 men were reported as fit for duty. The enemy at once invested the town and opened their trenches against it. From their fleet they had drawn an abundance of heavy artillery, and on October 9th their batteries opened a tremendous fire upon the works. Each day they pushed their trenches closer, and the British force was too weak, in comparison with the number of its assailants, to venture upon sorties. The fire from the works was completely overpowered by that of the enemy, and the ammunition was nearly exhausted. Day after day passed, and still the promised reinforcements did not arrive. Lord Cornwallis was told positively that the fleet would set sail on October 8th, but it came not, nor did it leave port until the 19th, the day on which Lord Cornwallis surrendered. On the 16th, finding that he must either surrender or break through, he determined to cross the river and fall on the French rear with his whole force, and then turn northward and force his way through Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the Jerseys. In the night the light infantry, the greater part of the guards, and part of the 23rd were embarked in boats, and crossed to the Gloucester side of the river before midnight. At this critical moment a violent storm arose which prevented the boats returning. The enemy's fire reopened at daybreak, and the engineer and principal officers of the army gave it as their opinion that it was impossible to resist longer. Only one 8-inch shell and 100 small ones remained. The defenses had in many places tumbled to ruins, and no effectual resistance could be opposed to an assault. Accordingly, Lord Cornwallis sent out a flag of truce and arranged terms of surrender. On the 24th, the fleet and reinforcements arrived off the mouth of the Chesapeake. Had they left New York at the time promised, the result of the campaign would have been different. The army surrendered as prisoners of war until exchanged, the officers with liberty to proceed on parole to Europe and not to serve until exchanged. The loyal Americans were embarked on the Bonito, sloop of war, and sent to New York in safety, Lord Cornwallis having obtained permission to send off the ship without her being searched, with as many soldiers on board as he should think fit, so that they were accounted for in any further exchange. He was thus enabled to send off such of the inhabitants and loyal troops as would have suffered from the vengeance of the Americans. The surrender of Lord Cornwallis's army virtually ended the war. The burden entailed on the people in England by the great struggle against France, Spain, Holland, and America, united in arms against her, was enormous. So long as there appeared any chance of recovering the colony, the English people made the sacrifices required of them, but the conviction that it was impossible for them to wage a war with half of Europe, and at the same time to conquer a continent, had been gaining more and more in its strength. Even the most sanguine were silenced by the surrender of Yorktown, and a cry arose throughout the country that peace should at once be made. As usual under the circumstances, a change of ministry took place. Negotiations for peace were at once commenced, and the war terminated in the acknowledgment of the entire independence of the United States of America. Harold with his companions had fallen back to Charleston with Lord Rawdon after the relief of '96, and remained there until the news arrived that the negotiations were on foot and that peace was now certain. Then he took his discharge and sailed at once for England, accompanied by Jake, Peter Lambton taking a passage to Canada to carry out his intention of settling at Montreal. Harold was now past 22, and his father and mother did not recognize him when, without warning, he arrived at their residence in Devonshire. It was 6 years since his mother had seen him when she sailed from Boston before its surrender in 1776. For a year he remained quiet at home, and then carried out his plan of returning to the American continent and settling in Canada. Accompanied by Jake, he sailed for the St. Lawrence, and purchased a snug farm on its banks, near the spot where it flows from Lake Ontario. He greatly improved it, built a comfortable house upon it, and 2 years later returned to England, whence he brought back his cousin Nellie as his wife. Her little fortune was used in adding to the farm, and it became one of the largest and best managed in the country. Peter Lambton found Montreal too crowded for him, and settled down on the estate, supplying it with fish and game so long as his strength enabled him to go about, and enjoying the society of Jack Pearson, who had married and established himself on a farm close by. As the years went on and the population increased, the property became very valuable, and Harold, before he died, was one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the colony. So long as his mother lived, he and his wife paid occasional visits to England, but after her death his family and farm had so increased that it was inconvenient to leave them. His father, therefore, returned with him to Canada and ended his life there. Jake lived to a good old age and was Harold's faithful friend and right-hand man to the last. The End. End of Chapter 21. Recording by Abigail Bartels. Ham Lake, Minnesota. True to the Old Flag by G. A. Henty.